Chapter 1. Sean. The late afternoon sun beat down on Sean as he grabbed another bale of hay and heaved it off the truck he was standing on. He watched as it landed on a pile in front of him with a thud. Bits of hay sprang up in every direction. He lifted the hem of his shirt and wiped his brow. 2 more bales and then he'd take a break. That thought caused his muscles to twitch. He was hot and needed a drink. Grabbing another bale by the strings, he shoved it off the bed of his truck. Just as he moved to lift the last bale, his phone rang. Sean straightened and pulled it out of his back pocket. He glanced down and swallowed. Dad. Why was Dad calling him? What had he done wrong? Clearing his throat, he attempted to push down all the emotions he felt for Rick Petty. That was a well that ran deep, but his dad wouldn't stop calling, so he might as well answer it. Hey, Dad. Sean? Yup, what's up? His dad was silent for a moment. No doubt it was because of his less than proper greeting. But Sean was never going to be that serious business guy his dad had wanted him to be. He was a rancher, through and through. Did you need something? He asked, sitting in silence, grating on his nerves. Have you talked to your grandfather today? Sean glanced out towards Austin's home, squinting as he saw Emma step out of the porch and wave to him. I'm just finishing up at the Maverick Ranch and then I'll head over. He was asleep when I left this morning. Just the thought of his grandfather's ranch caused his heart to swell. He was weeks away from it becoming his own. Travis, his cousin, was finished with the ranching life and wanted an out. Sean couldn't think of anything better than taking it over. It had been his dream since he was a kid, and nothing was going to stand in his way. Not his father, and not the ranch's obvious financial problems. None of it mattered. All the random jobs he took from Austin would end. He wouldn't have to work at the tavern anymore. He'd be an official rancher, and that couldn't come fast enough. So you haven't heard, his father said, pulling him from his thoughts. Sean tried not to groan. He hated it when his dad talked in code. Heard what, Dad? This dance around the deeper issues was getting exhausting. Part of him wished his dad would come out and say just how disappointed he was that Sean had picked a life as a rancher over becoming a partner in his firm. But his dad had to know a desk job wasn't his life. He needed to be outdoors, feeling the sun on his skin and the breeze around him. His dad cleared his throat on the other end. The Petty Ranch is getting audited. In that one short sentence, Sean's stomach sank to the ground. What? Your mother found the letter buried in some mail we got for your grandfather. The IRS is sending someone out there today. Sean hopped off the bed of the truck so he could pace. This was bad. It was no lie that all the ranchers in Moose Falls were struggling. 2 ranches had been shut down in the last 5 months. The amount it cost to run a ranch was increasing faster than the money coming in. He was just hoping the money he'd been able to save would help revive his grandfather's ranch. That thought was thinking faster than a cow in mud. What? How could this happen? He asked, not really expecting an answer. His dad sighed. It's a rough profession, Sean, like I've been telling you. Sean couldn't hear another one of his dad's lectures about this. Yeah, Dad, I got that. Hey, I gotta go. I need to get to Pop's ranch before the vulture comes. His dad began to protest, but Sean had already pulled the phone from his ear. Once he hung up, he shoved the phone into his back pocket. He leaned across the bed of the truck to pull the last bale of hay from the back and tossed it onto the pile. When he turned back around, he found Emma standing behind him. She was smiling as she rubbed her swollen belly. Hey, Sean. It's been a while since I've seen you. My mom barely let me leave New York this time. Sean reached out and gave her a one-armed hug. He planted a kiss on top of her head. It's okay, Ems. I've got lots going on. Emma laughed and pulled back. That's what Austin's been saying, something about Travis leaving and you taking over? At the mention of his grandfather's ranch, Sean's stomach twisted. Why did this audit have to come so close to when his dream was finally becoming a reality? He had the worst timing with everything. Instead of delving into his confusing feelings about what was about to happen, he patted her on the shoulder and changed the subject. That's quite a belly. Is Austin feeding you too much? Emma dropped her jaw as she smacked his shoulder. He tried to duck, but she made contact before he was able to get out of the way. "Sean Petty, how dare you say that to a pregnant lady?" Sean laughed as he held up his hands. "Oh, pregnant. Right. I think I heard that somewhere." Emma placed her hands on her hips and narrowed her eyes. "It's probably better that you're good in your own ranch. I don't need you commenting on how wide I'm getting when I've still got 2 months to go." She planted her hands on her hips and gave him a menacing stare. It was sweet that she was trying to be tough. Sean stilled his expression before he shot her a smile. "It's twins, right?" he asked as he moved to open the driver's door and slip into the truck, before he became the recipient of her retaliation again. "Sean Petty, never provoke a pregnant lady," she said, shaking her fist. Sean laughed as he started up his truck. "It's a compliment, Em. You grow 'em big. They'll be great ranchers." Emma pinched her lips as if she were fighting to keep her stern expression from morphing into a smile. He leaned out of his truck and gave her a wave. She sighed as she pushed her hair out of her face and waved at him. "I'll tell Austin that you're looking for him," she yelled above the roar of his truck. "Tell him I'll meet him at the tavern. I got a story to tell him." Sean shifted into first gear and pressed on the gas. Emma gave him a thumbs up as he pulled out of the ranch. Sean was grateful for the 15 minutes it took to drive from Maverick Ranch to his grandfather's. He needed all that time to think about what he was going to do or say to the auditor that the IRS was sending. By the time he pulled up to his grandfather's 100-year-old house, he turned off his truck. He'd come to the conclusion that he wasn't going to let some hotshot guy from the city come in and tell him what he could or couldn't do with the ranch. It was going to be his in just a few short weeks, and nothing was going to stand in his way. Sean opened his door and jumped onto the gravel drive. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. Stress was beginning to crawl its way across his muscles. The itch to swim tugged at his mind. But just as he thought about getting into the water, his right shoulder ached. He hadn't gotten into the water since senior year of high school, since he'd been kicked by that heifer and she broke his shoulder. It was at that moment that he needed to make a change in his life. What else could he do when he'd stood there in front of the recruiter, listening to Purdue say that he no longer qualified for the scholarship they'd promised him? Sean slammed the door, hoping to push out the memories that were bogging him down. Right now, he needed to focus on meeting the beast, and not on reliving the glory days. Swimming was in his past, but his ranch was his future. He wasn't going to let some pencil pusher come take it away from him. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way over to the 2-story house and up the porch steps. The swing shifted in the sweet summer breeze. This house had been in his family for 5 generations. It was all he knew, and he'd fight for it. He pulled open the screen door and wiped his boots on the front mat. Voices could be heard in the back. Sean smiled as he made his way into the kitchen. "Sean, that you?" his grandfather called out. "Yep, I'm back. Hey, got a call from Dad. He said something interesting." Sean walked down the hall, past the pictures of the generations that had lived here, had raised families here. "Something about a dragon coming from the IRS? You're getting audited?" He stepped into the kitchen and almost choked on his tongue. Sitting at the table across from Pop's was a woman in a business suit. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun at the nape of her neck. She had bright blue eyes, and when her gaze landed on him, she raised her eyebrows. "Sean," Pop said in a gravelly voice, "this is Christine. She's the dragon the IRS sent." Sean stared at her and then made his way over to the fridge. He pulled it open and rested his arm on the door as he stared inside of it. He took a deep breath as he tried to calm his nerves. When he thought that the auditor was going to be a male, the idea of giving him a hard time had seemed fitting, but staring at the blue eyes of Christine gave him an uneasy feeling. A moment later, once he'd gathered his wits, he grabbed a Coke and turned around, swinging the fridge door shut behind him. He popped back the tab and took a long drink. Once he was done, he looked over at Pops and Christine, who were both watching him. He set the can down on the counter and ran his hands through his hair. "Sorry," he said. Christine's eyebrows rose again. "I'm sorry for what?" "For calling you a dragon." Christine laughed and shook her head. "I've heard worse." "I don't doubt it." "Sean," Pop said. When Sean glanced over at him, he shrugged. Why was his grandfather acting so calm? This woman was here to put their ranch out of business. The only reason the IRS cared about a small ranch in Montana was because they're going to shut it down. Whatever his grandfather had done to tick off the government was most likely not fixable. They were just sending an executioner out as a formality. They'd already made their decision. Christine stood and stuck out her hand. Mr. Petty, I'm sure you have an idea about the type of person I am, but believe me, the government just wants to tie up a few loose ends. If you're cooperative, then I don't see this lasting longer than a few days. I'll be out of your hair, and you can go back to doing whatever it is that you do. She smiled up at him. Acid rose up from Sean's stomach. Whatever it is that you do? Was she serious? How was she supposed to give an accurate depiction of the ranch that he'd grown up on his entire life, from just a few papers and receipts? This was his life, the home he fought about with his father every day. How could he trust that she'd fight for them, when she didn't even know what it was that they did? Do you do this a lot? Sean asked, glancing down at her outstretched hand, then folding his arms and leaning against the counter. He narrowed his gaze as he studied her. Christine glanced from him back to Pops and dropped her hand. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Sean hated being a jerk, but there was no way he'd just sit back and allow this woman to come into his life and turn it upside down. He'd fight for it until his last breath. How many ranchers have you audited, Mrs.? He raised his eyebrows. It's actually Miss Jordan. Her cheeks hinted pink as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. And this is the first one. Sean snorted. Of course it was. Just his luck to be sent the rookie, a girl out to prove herself. He could see his dreams of owning this place disappearing before his eyes. It was over. Well, isn't that just great? He said, pushing off the counter and pulling open the back door. Where are you going, Sean? Pops called from behind him. Sean just waved his question away as he headed toward the barn. He needed a minute to process what was happening. He needed to get out of here. In 5 minutes, he had his horse Jersey saddled, and he pulled himself up onto her back. He'd go for a ride, and then come back and face the world. Right now, he needed the expansiveness of Montana to calm him down. Chapter 2. Christine took a deep breath as she stared after Sean's retreating frame. Her stomach was in knots as she watched him stomp across the grass and over to the large red barn behind the house. Tylen had warned her that going out into the field was going to be hard, which Christine knew. But Tylen hadn't warned her that there would be bull-headed cowboys to deal with, or that they'd be attractive. At least the weather-worn cowboy across from her was kind. Remembering Mr. Petty next to her, she turned and gave him a sheepish look. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset your grandson. Mr. Petty waved her comment away. Oh dear, don't worry about it. Sean's always been like that. It's just his personality. And ever since his accident, he glanced over her with eyes wide. I mean, he just has a hard time letting things go. Christine leaned across the table. Accident? He seems mentally there. Sean seemed more angry than slow. But this was her first interaction with him. What did she know? Mr. Petty paled as he shook his glass of lemonade, the ice clinking against the sides of the cup. Nothing like that. He's just had some adjusting to do when certain dreams were taken away. That's all. Christine let her gaze fall to the window, where she saw Sean emerge from the barn on horseback. He shook the reins and the animal took off. The memory of his brown eyes raced back to her, the piercing way they stared into hers. But when he spoke, his obvious disdain for her erased any attraction she might have had towards him. Interesting, she said, bringing her attention back into the room. She smiled over at Mr. Petty. He was a nice guy, and she hated what she was about to do. Digging into people's past to make sure they hadn't lied to the government wasn't exactly how she'd seen her life going. But it was her job, and that was the first time Parker, her supervisor, had agreed to let her go out into the field. It was hard being the niece of the top dog. She felt as if she had to prove herself over everyone else. Parker certainly wasn't happy that she got assigned to work under him. Perhaps he felt it was a test from her uncle. Parker had pretty much told her that her connections couldn't save her if she screwed up, and he certainly hinted that she was bound to screw up. So even though Mr. Petty seemed nice, she couldn't risk her job by deciding to care. Well, Mr. Petty, here's a list of the forms and receipts that I need to see. Basically, anything you've claimed as a deduction for the last 3 years. I need to see the proof of that. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. She tapped them on the table and then slid the pile over to him. Mr. Petty stared down at it and then back up to her.
Okay,
he said.
I'll get Sean to pull my boxes down from the attic.
Christine nodded. How long until you think he's back? Mr. Petty pushed away from the table and stood. He made his way over to the fridge and pulled open the door. When he turned back around, he had a pitcher of lemonade in his hands. He walked over to his cup, the fridge door shutting behind him.
That's one thing you'll learn about a Montana ranch. Nothing takes precedence over the livestock.
His gaze moved to the window where he got a nostalgic look on his face. Christine nodded. What a different life than the one she lived in Washington, D.C. A place that stayed up all night and never rested. Granted, everyone there never stopped working as well. But Christine had a feeling it was for a completely different reason. Well, I should probably head back into town to find a place to stay. She pushed away from the table and grabbed her purse. That way you can get working on the list I gave you. She nodded towards the pile next to Mr. Petty.
You're staying in town?
He asked. Of course. It's not like I can camp out here. She smiled over at him. Mr. Petty nodded.
Good idea. Well, I guess I'll see you in the morning and I'll get started on your list.
That would be great. Christine made her way over to the back door, where she pulled up the material from her pant leg and slipped on her shoes. The sooner you get that gathered for me, the sooner I can get out of your hair. She shouldered her purse and the strap of her briefcase, and then reached out and twisted the door handle.
Well, you have a fantastic night, Miss Jordan.
Mr. Petty leaned against the counter. Thank you, she said as she turned the handle and pulled open the door. The air was hot and surrounded her as she stepped onto the porch. Fields spanned out in front of her as she took in her surroundings. It was beautiful here. So much so that it took her breath away. She made her way down the porch steps and over to her rental car. Once inside, she started it up, pulled out of the driveway, and took a left. She bounced and jostled on the dirt road. Dust picked up all around her. Sighing, she settled back into her seat. Her first field assignment seemed to be off to a good start. Mr. Petty was nice and seemed compliant. From the horror stories Ty Lynn had told her, Christine had been convinced that she was going to be spit on, shot at, or have a dog released on her, or any combination of the three. But besides Sean's bad attitude, it had gone smoothly, and she really couldn't fault him for his reaction towards her. She was there to investigate his family. If she did find something amiss, it was her responsibility to report it, no matter how nice those who were getting investigated were. She gripped the wheel as she thought back to her conversation with Parker, the one where he told her that he doubted her ability to be impartial to clients, that every time she got involved, emotions seemed to cloud her judgment. He'd given her hints that her job was on the line. This was her last chance to prove herself to him. If she failed, she shouldn't bother coming back, and her uncle didn't care. He'd told her that she'd report it to Parker, no matter what. Just as she slowed in front of a random stop sign, the rental jolted and a loud popping sound caused her to jump. Her eyes widened as the hood of the car started billowing smoke. She slammed on her brakes and turned the car off. Oh no, she said as the pungent smell of burning rubber filled the air. She grabbed the handle and pushed open the door. Her heels dug into the ground as she stepped out and made her way to the front of the car. The smoke had turned a dark shade of gray. She didn't know much about engines, but she knew that this wasn't good. Really? She asked, glancing up at the sky. It was just her luck, stuck in the middle of nowhere with a broken rental car. She allowed herself a second to feel sorry for her situation, and then she sighed and made her way to the back door of the car. After pulling out her purse and locating her phone, she swiped it on. Come on, she said as she tilted her phone toward the sky. Give me some bars. But there was nothing. Zilch. She threw her phone back into her purse and groaned. What was she going to do now? If she was completely honest with herself, she had no idea where she was. And from the looks of the car, there was no way she could get it to turn on long enough for the GPS to give her a good idea of the direction she needed to go. She took a deep breath and turned her gaze toward the sun, summoning everything she had learned in the 6 months she'd done Girl Scouts as a kid. But she'd joined when it was cookie season, and she doubted her skill in convincing people to buy cookies would help in this situation. She glanced down the road the way she'd just come. The only option she had was to head back to the petty ranch. As her heels sunk deeper into the dirt, she knew that there was no way she was walking there in the shoes she was wearing. Making her way to the trunk, she opened up the back and pulled out her suitcase. After unzipping it, she rifled around. "Are you kidding me?" she called out when she realized that she'd forgotten her tennis shoes. In her haste to pack this morning, she must have left them next to the front door of her studio apartment. Slamming the trunk closed, she sighed. She would just have to make do with what she had. She slipped off her suit coat to reveal her satin camisole. The breeze raced around her skin, cooling her. She sighed, feeling the agitation that built up inside of her lessen. After changing her bun out for a ponytail, she lifted her purse and briefcase and crisscrossed the straps across her body. Hopefully she could remember the roads back to the ranch, or come across a car. But from the silence that surrounded her, the chances of finding any signs of life were slim to none. Abandoning her car, she made her way down the gravel road. Her heels stabbed into the dirt, but she pushed away her frustration. She just needed to think positive thoughts. That was all. 20 minutes later, the only thing she could think about was the huge blisters that had begun to form on the back of her heels. Her feet hurt, her back hurt, and she was thirsty. Montana stunk. The wind picked up, swirling her hair around her head. She cursed as she pulled strands from her mouth. Next time she had a field assignment, she needed to do some research first, and be sure to pack the right attire. She sighed as she paused, glancing around to make sure she recognized something, anything. But the cows and the grass and the dirt all looked the same. She wasn't sure if she was headed in the right direction anymore. She could just see the newspaper article now. IRS auditor found dead in Montana. Then everything her stepmom had ever said about her would ring true. That she wouldn't ever amount to anything, that failure was her only future. Turning up dead on the side of the road was pretty much that prophecy coming true. Movement to her left caught her eye. She looked over to see a black horse racing across the field. She stopped to study the animal. It looked similar to the horse Sean had taken off on earlier. As she focused harder, she realized that it was the aggravating cowboy. She thought about yelling and waving her arms, but that ridiculous idea only lasted a second before she pushed it out. There was no way she was going to ask Sean Petty for help. With the way he'd glared at her earlier, he'd probably take her farther away from where she wanted to go. So she continued making her way down the road. She groaned. From the corner of her eye, she'd seen the black horse draw closer. She quickened her pace and kept her head down. Maybe if she looked like she knew where she was going, he would leave her alone. The sound of the horse hooves filled the air. Christine kept on walking as if she hadn't noticed.
"It's amazing you can walk that fast in those shoes."
Sean's deep, playful voice sounded from behind her. Christine swallowed as she slowed, and tried to nonchalantly turn around. She squinted as she glanced up at him. "Oh, hi! Where'd you come from?" Sean leaned forward on the saddle, resting an arm against the horn.
"You mean since you stopped and looked right at me?"
Not knowing what to do, Christine waved him away. "Oh, that was you?" Sean drew his eyebrows together.
"Did you think it was someone else?"
He chuckled like that was a ridiculous idea. She glared at him, but it didn't seem to faze him. Instead, he glanced behind her.
"Where's your car? Did you destroy its dreams as well?"
Heat flooded her body. It broke down. It's back there." She waved in the direction she'd just come.
"Because you chased it away?"
She sighed. What was with this guy? Well, at least I don't run from my problems. I face them.
"I face my problems."
Christine pushed away the loose strands of hair that clung to her face. Right. The speeding off on a horse is facing them. Why was she letting this man get her all flustered? Sure, he was good looking, he was tan and, from where she stood, had muscles for days. But he was rude and stuck up, and the last thing she wanted in a rescuer. Sean clicked his tongue.
"Well, Since you already know so much about me, I'll leave you to your meandering and head back to my ranch. After all, you seem to have everything under control." He nudged his horse forward. "Do write me and let me know if you make it into town." Christine stared at him. Was he serious? He was going to leave her here? To die? She silently cursed herself, but it was too late to ask for help now, so she forced a smile. "Sounds good." Sean studied her as he circled her on his horse. It was almost as if he were waiting for her to suddenly beg him for help. There was no way she'd do that now, not when what was left of her pride was hanging by a thread. "Don't worry about me. I was a Girl Scout." Sean pursed his lips and nodded. "They taught you how to survive in Montana in the dark, with coyotes and bears?" He raised his eyebrows. "No, there are no bears in Montana." She glanced around. "Were there?" Sean shrugged. "That wasn't something they covered in your lessons? Well, I guess you'll have to find out now, won't you?" He clicked his tongue, and his horse started to walk away. "Wait!" Christine called after him, but then winced. The last thing she wanted to do was sound desperate. Sean pulled on the reins and glanced behind him. The smug look on his face made her blood boil. "Yeah, change your mind?" Christine let out a low breath. "Just wondering if you had some water, that's it." Sean nudged the horse to turn so he could look at her. "Water?" He shook his head. "Nope, I'm all out." He leaned forward again. "But I thought that preparation was something they taught in Scouts." "I didn't expect to get stranded in the middle of nowhere." Christine tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "But if you don't have anything, then I guess I'm good." She waved her hand toward the road. "You can go." Sean scoffed and headed in the direction she motioned. "If you say so," he said. He circled her one more time and then dug his heels into the horse's side. "I'll see you tomorrow, Dragon Lady," he called over his shoulder as the horse took off. Christine watched as he grew smaller the farther he got. When he disappeared down a hill, she gritted her teeth. The only person who'd passed by her in the last half hour was now gone, because she'd driven him away. She pushed her bags up farther onto her shoulders and winced as she took a few more steps. Her stepmom had been right about one thing. She could definitely be as stubborn as a mule. She only hoped that her stubbornness wouldn't result in her death or serious maiming. Chapter 3. Sean. Sean made his way down the road, leaving Christine in his dust. Frustration grew inside of him the farther he got. What was her problem? He wasn't invading her life, trying to destroy the only place she'd ever known. If anything, she should be nice to him, or at least ask for his help. He slowed Jersey to a trot. There was no reason to wear his horse out just because he was angry. Besides, it wasn't like he was going to go far. In a few minutes, when he'd have time to calm himself down, he'd turn around and head back to Christine. He hadn't been taught by his mom or grandma to leave a woman in distress, even if she was hell-bent on convincing him that she was fine and could get back to town by herself. Apparently, hiking wasn't something she'd been taught in Scouts. If it was, she'd realize that there was still 20 miles between her and town. She'd be rolling into Moose Falls Motel at about 2 in the morning. "Whoa, girl," he said, pulling on Jersey's reins to stop her. He patted her shoulders and gave her a quick rub-down. "Do you think we should go get the dragon?" Jersey nickered and tossed her head. Sean smiled. "Yeah, my thoughts exactly," he said as he patted her back again. He glanced beside him and groaned, his grandmother's voice echoing in his mind. "A gentleman never leaves a lady. He helps her, no matter what." He could see his grandmother standing in the kitchen with her hands on her hips. She was scolding him because he'd raced Jane, his kid sister, from the treehouse and won. Gran never understood how racing went. But now he was grown up, and he knew what the right thing was. So he clicked his tongue and tapped Jersey's side. "Come on, girl, let's go get the dragon." A few minutes later, at the top of the hill, he saw Christine making her way toward him. He saw her look at him and then drop her gaze. He smiled, enjoying the shocked expression that raced across her face. As he approached, he glanced down at her. "Well, I figured I didn't need the government after me for taxes and murder." He pulled on Jersey's reins and she stopped right next to Christine. "Need a ride?" Christine scoffed. So you abandoned me as what, a joke? Sean stared at her. What was this lady's problem? She had no reason to dislike him. He'd done nothing wrong. I guess I wanted to give you some time to figure out if you wanted some help. She wiped her brow and squinted up at him. I think I've got this under control. He scoffed as he glanced around. Do you even know where you're going? Man, this woman was stubborn. Hadn't he given her time enough to realize that? Maybe she had no idea what she was doing? But from the way her gaze met on his head, he realized that she just might be as bullheaded as him. He smirked at her as he took her in. A feeling arose in his gut that he couldn't quite push away. One that said he'd be lying if he told himself she didn't intrigue him. A woman who spoke her mind was refreshing. Christine stopped walking, pulled both bags off of her shoulders, and set them down on the ground next to her. Sean tried to ignore how soft her skin looked underneath her lace camisole. She pulled her hair from the tie and shook it. Crap. He should have continued the ride to town instead of coming back. His mind was racing, so he swallowed and glanced down the road. He needed to remember what she was here to do. Focus on that. After her hair was pulled back up into a ponytail and her bags returned to her shoulders, Sean looked down at her. She was studying him. Heat rushed across his body. Had she seen his reaction toward her? From the mischievous glint in her eye, he knew that the chance was pretty high. Do you want to ride or not? He asked, leaning forward and staring down at her. He had things to do, and arguing with Christine was not one of them, no matter how fun it was. She glanced over at Jersey and then back up to him. Is there room? She eyed the saddle. Sean swung his leg over and hopped off Jersey. There's definitely room, he said, moving closer to her. Christine's eyes widened. What are you doing? She asked, taking a step back. If I'm going to give you a ride, you're going to have to get up onto this horse. He extended his hand while grasping onto the saddle with the other. Christine's skin paled as she stared at his hand. I've never, her voice dropped to a whisper, ridden a horse before. He laughed. It's easy. Besides, I'll be right behind you doing most of the work. She paused. From the look on her face, he could tell she was having an internal battle. He wanted to laugh and poke fun at her, but decided against it. The decision to get onto the horse seemed to win out because she shook her head, reached out and took his hand. Sean tried to ignore the zap of electricity that raced up his skin from the contact. Silently, he cursed himself. This was the last thing he needed to be thinking about. Now slip your foot into the stirrup, he said, motioning toward the horse. Christine nodded, lifted her foot up, and slipped it onto the stirrup. Just as she got it situated, Jersey shifted and threw her off balance. She yelped and began to tip toward him. Out of instinct, Sean reached out and grabbed onto her. He let his hand rest on the small of her back as he met her gaze. You okay? He asked, cursing his voice for coming out so deep. Christine nodded as she eyed the saddle. I think so. Not wanting to risk another confusing reaction from touching her, Sean held onto her waist. She whipped around and parted her lips like she was about to protest, but Sean wasn't going to listen. Grab onto the sides of the saddle and I'll boost you up. He kept his gaze down, trying hard to focus on anything else but Christine and how tiny her waist felt in his hands. Okay, she said. Once she was gripping the sides, Sean lifted her up and waited while she swung her leg onto the other side. As soon as it was evident that she wasn't going to fall off, he dropped his hands. He rubbed his fingertips with his thumbs, hoping to dispel the feel of her body against him. This whole thing had been a huge mistake. Scoot forward, he said, nodding toward the horn of the saddle. Christine moved. I'm going to need you to move forward even farther. He patted Jersey's neck right above where the saddle ended. After a bit of shifting, Christine slipped over the horn and onto Jersey. She teetered a bit, gripping onto the poor horse's mane. Not wasting any time, Sean lifted her bags, hung them from the sides of the saddle, and heaved himself up. Once he was situated, he wrapped his arm around Christine's waist. Hey, what? She whipped around to stare at him. If you don't want to fall off Jersey, you're going to have to let me hold on to you, he said. She stared at him. He could see flecks of gold in her eyes. Hoping she didn't notice how being this close to her was sending his senses haywire, he shot her a grin. "You could always walk," he said, hoping that reminding her of her situation would help take the focus off of him. She narrowed her eyes and turned around. "It's fine." With that, he grabbed the reins with his hands while still keeping an arm wrapped around her waist and nudged Jersey forward. The horse complied and began walking down the road. Sean tried to ignore how Christine felt, pressed against his chest, or how her hair smelled when the wind picked it up. He needed to focus on something else. "So, how long have you been an auditor for?" She peeked behind her to meet his gaze. "Did you just ask me a personal question? I'm surprised you want to learn anything about the dragon." Sean chuckled. "Hey, in my defense, when I first called you that, I thought you were a dude." He felt Christine tense from the statement. Why? Because only men can find success in the IRS? Sean stared at her. He loved women and knew how capable they were. The most influential people in his life were women. "That's not what I meant to say at all. I have nothing but respect for women," he said. "You have a funny way of showing it," she whispered, so low that he almost didn't hear her. "You have to see this situation from my standpoint. 2 ranches around here went bankrupt because of back taxes they owed the IRS. Hard-working, family-oriented ranches had to sell everything they owned and move because they can't keep up with all the expenses that they incur just to do what they love." He swallowed as pride rose up in his chest. He loved his job. He loved his ranch. What were they meant to do? He felt Christine's shoulders relax as she nodded. "I get that. It has to be hard." Sean snorted. What did a woman who only had a cushy job in Washington, D.C. know about hard work? "How much does it cost to become an auditor?" Christine played with the hair of Jersey's mane. "Just the cost of my degree." "So, 50,000 once everything was said and done?" She nodded. 50,000 covers about 1 used tractor. Do you know how many tractors it takes to run a ranch? Material it takes to run a ranch?" He tapped on Jersey's reins to urge her to a trot. At the pace they were going, it was going to take them an hour to get to the motel. "I didn't realize." "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to help you understand. It's not easy with all the regulations." Christine nodded. "I get that. And I'm going to try to help you in any way I can. But this is the government we're talking about. I can't change the rules." Frustration boiled up inside of Sean. This was not what he wanted to hear. Why had he even brought it up? He should have just kept quiet. Of course she was going to make sure the government's rules were followed. That's all she was. He was stupid to think that he could convince her to look outside of the law and think for herself. The conversation grew silent as they continued down the road. He wasn't sure what to say to her, or if she'd even listen. "I want you to know that I'm going to be as objective as I can," she said. Her voice was low and Sean had to lean forward to hear her. He swallowed. He hadn't meant to assume that she was going to judge his ranch harshly and do everything in her power to close them down. He barely knew her, and yet he'd made a rash judgment, just as he was convinced she'd done to him. "I'm sorry. I'm sure you will be." Silence fell around them once more. She shifted a little, causing him to tighten his grip on her so she didn't slide off. "You okay?" he asked. It couldn't be too comfortable, riding a horse this way, especially if she'd never done it before. "I think I'll survive. Besides, it beats walking in those heels in my blistered feet." Sean eyed her. "Yeah, you really didn't plan for your trip to Montana. Jeans and cowboy boots aren't just fashionable, they're essential." Christine nodded, causing her hair to swish and brush his cheek. "I'll have to do some shopping while I'm here, then." "I can recommend some good places. Well, actually, one place. And it's also the local grocery store, pharmacy, and nursery." Sean smiled. He loved his small town. There was no way he'd leave it for any high-paying job in Great Falls. Besides, his grandfather needed him, apparently more than he was letting on, especially with the IRS knocking at the door. Christine laughed. "I'll have to check it out, at least once my car's fixed." Before he could stop himself, Sean blurted out, "I can give you rides." He felt Christine tense. "Backpedal, Sean." "What I mean to say was, I can point you in the direction of Pete's utility store." "Actually, a ride might be for the best. Who knows how long it will be until they fix my rental? And I'm guessing a place like Moose Falls doesn't have a car rental store. Sean hesitated. What was he getting himself into? Why was he helping out the dragon? If he was smart, he'd leave her stranded on the side of the road to fend for herself. But there was something about her. Seeing her standing on the side of the road with her heels half buried in the dirt, sweating like a pig, had made her seem just a tad more human. And vulnerable. Like a lady in distress. And he couldn't just abandon her. So he took a deep breath and spoke the word he hoped he wouldn't regret. Sure.
Chapter 4. Christine. By the time Sean's horse wandered into town, Christine's butt was completely numb, and the rest of her ached. The fact that she'd ever thought she was in shape was laughable. Her legs hurt, her abs hurt, her arms hurt. She couldn't imagine if she ached this bad, how she was going to feel after she had a night's sleep. Right now, all she wanted to do was get off the horse, take a hot shower, and climb into bed. Plus, getting away from Sean seemed like the best idea. Her mind raced from being this close to him, feeling his arms wrapped around her and his sculpted chest against her back. Plus, she'd be lying to herself if she said that him being so dedicated to his ranch wasn't intriguing. She had never felt that passionate about anything in her life. Becoming an auditor was just a means to an end. Her college counselor had advised her that it was the best route for her to take. An accounting degree wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She swallowed as she felt her emotions rise in her throat. What was happening to her? Perhaps it was the emotional roller coaster she'd been on since Parker threatened her job. She either needed to get serious or find somewhere else to go. She was going to have to call Ty Lynn tonight and ask her if every field assignment was this emotionally taxing. Maybe it was just this one. Parker had given it to her because he knew that it would break her. Better to have her quit than for him to fire her. It would look better for her uncle. Sean slowed his horse as they approached the row of buildings that ran the length of the road in front of him. The sign that said Susan's Diner shone against the encroaching evening light. Food sounded amazing, along with getting off this blasted horse. Once the horse had stopped, Sean jumped down and held out his hand for her. She reached for it gratefully and shifted so that her body could slide off the horse. Wait! But Sean's protest was lost as he tipped back. He clung onto her and the two of them crashed to the ground. Christine could feel the impact of him landing on his back through his chest. Her hands splayed out against his shirt. Hot red heat permeated her skin. I'm sorry, she said. Was it wrong that she was impressed that he'd kept his arms wrapped around her? That he'd given himself as a sacrifice to keep her safe? Thanking him seemed prudent. She needed to make sure he was all right first. Are you okay? She asked, peering up into his face. His eyes were pinched shut, and his face was contorted in a look of pain. Did I hurt you? She asked, glancing down to make sure his arms and legs weren't twisted in an unnatural way. He didn't look like he'd broken a bone. Relieved that she hadn't seriously maimed him, she peeked back up at him. He still hadn't opened his eyes. Sean, can you speak? He groaned. Dragon, is that you? Christine rolled her eyes as she moved to get off of him. But her legs were numb from the horse ride, and before she knew what she was doing, she kneed him between the legs. Sean let out a yelp and lifted his head off the ground. You need me, he said. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I'm so sorry, she said, as she knelt down next to him. She reached out but wasn't quite sure what to do, so she just left her hands hanging in the air. What can I do? Sean curled to his side. Just don't touch me, he said. Christine dropped her hands and nodded. Got it. She rocked back onto her butt and sat cross-legged next to him. Not sure what to say, she opened her lips and said the first thing that came to her mind. That was very Mr. Darcy of you, he groaned in response. She realized that he might not know who Mr. Darcy was. Mr. Darcy? From Pride and Prejudice? It's my all-time favorite movie. The way you saved me, it was totally something you would do. He whispered something that sounded like crazy lady, but she wasn't sure. So she decided to sit back and wait for his pain to go away. After a few minutes, he peeked up at her. His face was no longer contorted in a look of pain. "You okay now?" she asked. He nodded with his head still lying on the gravel.
"I'll be fine. Just stay over there. It's dangerous for you to touch me."
Christine held up her hands. "Well, yes, I have been known to inflict pain on unsuspecting cowboys. Why do you think they call me the Dragon?" She shot him a look, and he scoffed.
"I had a sense,"
he said, as he pressed his hands down on the ground and sat up. Once he was standing, Christine joined him. He swept his gaze over her.
"Are you okay?"
Christine studied him. Was he really asking her if she was okay? Sean Petty was challenging everything she thought she knew about him, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. Auditing a man she disliked was much easier than auditing a confusing one. "I should be asking you that. You selflessly sacrificed yourself for me. Are you okay?"
"Selflessly? I like that. If reporters reach out to you and ask you about this incident, those are the exact words I want you to say."
He peered over at her and gave her a small smile.
"That and compare me to Mr. Darcy. It'll drive the ladies crazy."
She laughed, for the first time in a long time, and it felt good. "I'll make sure to do that." Sean straightened and started to move down towards the doors of Susan's diner. His gait was slow. It seemed like he was trying to shake off what had just happened. Christine moved to follow him, but as she took her first step, her left leg gave out, causing her to stumble. Thankfully, she didn't go down, but Sean noticed, and the concerned look in his eye caused heat to race across her body again. She felt like a woman going through menopause.
"You okay?"
he asked, reaching out and brushing his fingers against her skin. Zaps of electricity jolted up her arm from the feather-like touch. "I think so," she breathed out. When she could finally process her thoughts through her clouded brain, she realized that he was staring at her with a puzzled expression. Desperate to redeem herself, she said, "Well, as good as I can be. I did just ride a horse in a position that no one should ever ride a horse in. I really don't think my legs will go back to normal after today." Sean's gaze moved down to her legs.
"Well, that would be a pity."
Then he glanced back up at her. She saw that his cheeks hinted pink. He parted his lips and shook his head.
"I didn't mean for it to come out that way."
Christine raised her eyebrows. What did you mean? Had he just complimented her legs? What was happening? He growled and nodded towards the diner.
"Let's just get some food. It might be the low blood sugar that's getting to my head."
He grabbed Jersey's reins and clicked his tongue. She began to walk behind him. Once they were at a post, he tied her up. Christine followed him, wincing with every step. "Sure, that's what you meant." He shot her a look, but then moved toward the front doors of the diner and pulled it open. He waved her in. When she stepped inside, her eyes widened. It was a quaint diner with checkerboard tiles and red leather booths. A woman with her hair pulled back in a messy bun was standing next to a table with a pad of paper in one hand and a pen on the other. When Sean cleared his throat, she looked over at him. "Sean," she said, waving to the couple she was talking to and making her way over. Her gaze ran over him the closer she got. "What happened to you? You look like you were run over and hung out to dry." She motioned towards Christine, who suddenly realized just what she must look like. "So do you, sweetie." Desperate to redeem herself, she ran her fingers through her snarled hair. Sean waved away her comment.
"We just need some food, Susan."
Susan smiled and took 2 menus from the stack next to her. "Well, you've come to the right place." She nodded in the direction of the far table and Sean followed. Christine winced as she kept pace with him. Sean slipped into the booth and Christine moved to sit, but then paused. There was no way she was going to be able to relax until she saw the damage that had been done by the Montana wind and heat. She smiled at the woman who was waiting for her to sit. "Bathroom?" The woman dug around in her apron and pulled out a key. "The one inside is out of order. You gotta use the spare out back," she said, motioning towards the front door. Christine took the key and nodded, heading back outside. Once she was inside the bathroom and had locked the door, she turned and gasped. Her hair was wind-blown and knotted. Her mascara seemed to have melted in the Montana heat, and she had black rings under her eyes. She turned on the water and let her hands fill up. It took a few good scrubbings until her face was clean. When her hands were dried, she pulled her hair from her ponytail and raked her fingers through it.
When she finally looked presentable, she headed out of the bathroom and around the building. Just as she neared the door, her phone rang. She stopped and pulled it from her back pocket. Tylynn. Smiling, she wiped the screen and brought the phone up to her ear. Hello? Chris, that you? Tylynn? I can't hear you. Your reception must be bad. Can you hear me? Tylynn's voice was scratchy and cut out every few seconds. Tylynn, I can sort of hear you. Can you hear me? I can't hear you, so I'll make this short. Hope things are good in Montana. Parker's on a hunt for your blood. If you don't do well, it's going to be the end of you. Before Christine could answer, the call cut off. She pulled her phone from her ear and stared down at it, her stomach sinking. What was happening to her? Just because she'd misplaced some files for a big case, suddenly she couldn't handle anything? The longer she was here, the more she realized that Parker really was setting her up to fail. She gritted her teeth as she pulled open the front door. She wasn't going to let that happen. She'd succeed if it was the last thing she did. There was no way she'd let Parker get the better of her. She'd rock this audit and then march into his office Monday morning and quit. She was done being intimidated by that small, bald man. When she got to the booth, she sat down with more confidence than she'd felt earlier. Suddenly, the distraction that Sean was causing wasn't as bad anymore. Whatever she'd been feeling from their previous encounter was just stress-induced. She needed to get her head on straight and accomplish what she'd come here to do. Sean was studying her as she set the key down on the table and picked up the menu. You look better, he said, running his gaze over her. I do clean up well. She let his compliment wash over her. Despite her better judgment, heat raced to her cheeks. I mean, you look pretty pleased with yourself. Was your trip successful? In a matter of seconds, the heat on her skin changed to the heat of embarrassment. What exactly had he thought she was doing? That's not why I went in there. He held up his hands. I get it. Everybody does it. I mean, they wrote a children's book about it. Christine stared at him. What was happening? How had this conversation changed so quickly? Sean smiled and leaned forward. I was just kidding, he said, laughing. Christine rolled her eyes. Seriously? How old are you? She read her menu, grateful for the distraction it gave her. He smiled, but then his expression stilled. Sorry, sometimes I speak without thinking, he said. Oh, has this happened more and more since your accident? What? He looked confused for a moment, and just as he moved to ask more, the waitress returned to see if they were ready. They ordered and she wrote the items on her pad of paper. After she was finished, she tucked the bathroom key into her pocket and made her way toward the back, where she pushed open the swinging door. Now alone, Christine stared at Sean. Time to ask the questions she needed answered. She took a long drink of water and then placed the cup down. So, tell me about Petty Ranch. Sean was sipping on his water as he eyed her. Once half the glass was gone, he pushed it away and cleared his throat. What do you want to know? Not sure how to approach this, she decided it would be best to sound the least intimidating. Less like she was investigating him. How long have you worked there? He drummed the table with his fingertips. Work? More like lived, and my whole life. And that's been how long? He leaned closer to her. Are you asking me how old I am? She shrugged. I figured the government knew everything about me. He sighed and leaned back. 29, and the Petty Ranch has been in my life for 29 years, no question. So he was only 4 years older than her. She pushed away the butterflies that flitted around her stomach. Why did it matter how old he was? She was acting like a starstruck teenager. Okay, how have things been for your grandfather, financially? Sean's playful expression turned stony. He shifted on his seat as he dropped his gaze to the tabletop. I'm surprised you didn't get all the dirt before coming out here. Well, that answered one question. The Petty Ranch was in trouble. Just how much was something she was going to have to figure out. But there were problems. I think you have a skewed idea of what exactly the government knows. Before Sean could answer, the waitress came back and deposited their plates in front of them. Sean seemed to take that as a good sign to keep quiet as his focus shifted to his food and getting it inside of him. Christine studied him as she thought back on the previous events of the day. So much had happened in a short amount of time that she really hadn't had time to process it all.
As they continued to eat in silence, her mind began to clear. She'd been ridiculous to think that there was any attraction between her and this cowboy. The man called her a dragon, for heaven's sake. They were from 2 different worlds, and she was here to audit his grandfather's ranch. It was best to keep things platonic between them, for all parties involved. For the rest of their meal, they kept their conversation light. Instead of delving into each other's pasts, Christine talked about the latest news or the weather, which Sean seemed compliant to respond to. Once they paid and headed out, Christine began to feel like she was starting to get a grip on whatever could be going on between her and Sean. As they rounded the corner of the building to see Jersey working on a patch of grass, Sean stopped. His gaze was focused on the ground. Christine glanced up at him. What was happening? Can you just make sure you give us a chance before you decide? His voice was low as he brought his gaze up to meet hers. There was something there, a pain that she'd seen earlier that day when he'd walked into the kitchen and she'd met him for the first time. Sean, it doesn't work like that. I gather the information and report back. I'm not a judge. It's not my job to decide what happens. She reached out and touched his elbow. He had to know that she wouldn't lie. If there was nothing to hide, then they would be fine. But I'm sure they take into consideration what you say. If you tell them we're working to make things better, that has to make a difference. His gaze searched hers as if he were desperate to find an answer that she wasn't sure she could give him. I can try, but I think you overestimate my influence. He studied her and then shot her a half smile. That's all I wanted to hear. He started to walk towards Jersey. Christine wasn't sure she'd given him the right answer. She couldn't lie to him. If she did find out that something had been omitted, or a deduction taken when it shouldn't have been taken, she was going to have to report it. He had to know she'd do that. It was her job. She reached out and grabbed his elbow before he walked away. Sean, if there's something to find, though, I have to report it. You realize that, right? He turned and looked down at her. He forced a smile and nodded. Of course, I understand. With that, he turned and loosened Jersey's reins from the post and rubbed her behind her ears. Not wanting to stand outside and discuss this further, Christine decided the best thing she could do right now was to take a shower and get a good night's sleep. Then she'd face everything else in the morning. She followed behind Sean as he motioned toward the motel a few buildings down. Let's get you checked in, he said. Christine nodded. That was the best idea she'd heard in a long time. Chapter 5. Sean. Sean's alarm went off at 5 the next morning. Groaning, he reached out and slapped the snooze button. He'd give anything to stay asleep in his bed, but he had work on his ranch and heifers to brand with Austin. Thankfully, Tammy had agreed to take his shift at the tavern tonight. He was exhausted and way behind on sleep. He sighed. He was working like a dog to save money for a ranch that he might not inherit once Christine was done. He contemplated turning off his alarm and giving up, but that was literally impossible for him to do, not when his father's words flooded back to his mind. The words that fueled him through the hard days. Just wait, you'll come back. Once you wear yourself out, you'll come back. He pulled off his blanket and stood. There was no way he was going to let his father be right about anything. He was going to do this, and he was going to be successful if it killed him. After a shower and a cup of coffee, he snatched a donut from the bread box and grabbed his keys. If he was going to be up this early, then the dragon could get up. After he dropped her off at the motel, he'd gone to the tavern to work a shift. While he was there, he'd gotten a text from Austin saying Emma was having some contractions, so he couldn't leave her, which Sean understood. Besides, the bar had been busy that night, which was good for tips, but Sean hadn't crawled into bed until after 1. Exhaustion wasn't a luxury he was allowed, not when he had so much to fix up around the ranch. Every dollar was vital. He couldn't slow down now, or any time in the future. His boots made a crunching noise as he quickened his pace and made his way across the driveway and over to his truck. Once inside, he stuck the key into the ignition and peeled out of his driveway. 20 minutes later, he was pulling into the motel's parking lot. He turned off the engine and hopped out. Holding his cup of coffee in one hand, he slammed the driver's door and headed inside. Ava was sitting behind the front desk, trying to look like she wasn't falling asleep. Sean walked up and tapped the counter.
Not a morning person?
Ava jumped and grabbed her heart. You scared the crap out of me, Sean Petty. She flicked her red hair off her shoulder and gave him a scowl. Sean laughed as he held up his hand.
Sorry. Does George know you fall asleep on the job?
She groaned as she covered her face with her hands. I don't know why he has me working so early. He thinks there's going to be some surge of visitors, and if we're not open, he's going to miss out on their business.
Getting up early's good for you.
He smiled at her. Out of all the people in his graduating class, Ava was one who chose to stay. He wasn't sure why. She was smart, but something happened with her family and she stayed behind when all her friends left. She scoffed. Are you here just to critique my work ethic? Sean shook his head.
Nope, I'm looking for Christine, the IRS dragon I dropped off yesterday.
She tapped on the keyboard in front of her. Yep, I remember. Then she narrowed her eyes as she looked at him. Why do you want her?
Well, she asked me to come pick her up. This is the only time I had available. She's auditing my pop's ranch. Guess her car broke down and she's without a ride. Did she mention to you that I'd be giving her a ride?
Ava's expression softened as she nodded. Yeah, she did. I'll call her room. Ava picked up the phone and pressed it to her ear. After 2 attempts with no answer, she glanced back up at Sean as she set the receiver down on the base. No answer. I guess you can try knocking. She paused as she looked around. She's in room 103. Take a left and go down the hall. Sean pushed away from the counter and nodded.
Got it.
He followed Ava's directions and soon was standing outside of room 103. He raised his hand and knocked. After waiting a minute with no response, he tried again. Finally, the sound of locks turning caused him to take a step back. The door opened a sliver and Christine emerged. She looked half asleep as she met his gaze. Sean? She asked, her voice groggy. What are you doing here? He tried to ignore how adorable she looked with her hair tousled. As she opened the door, he saw that she was wearing the same silk tank top as yesterday. It peeked out from under the towel she'd wrapped around her body. Her legs looked as if they went on for days. Pulling his gaze up, he focused on the reason he was here. And that definitely was not to get distracted by her smooth skin.
I'm here to pick you up. You wanted a ride and I said I'd give you one.
She drew her brows together and glanced behind her into the dark room. It's 5:30. Sean swallowed. She needed to get ready, fast. He was already so behind.
You need to get moving. I've got things to do.
He waved his hand toward her, hoping that would help her move faster. She stared at him. Are you serious?
I'll wait for no woman. Come on, we've got to go.
She groaned as she pushed the door open. She muttered something under her breath. It sounded like insufferable cowboy, but he wasn't sure and decided to just ignore it. He didn't have time to justify her comment with a response. As he took a step toward her, she grabbed his cup of coffee from his hand and took a drink.
Hey,
he said, moving to grab it back. If you want me to be up this early, then you need to caffeinate me. She took another long drink before she handed it back to him. He growled as he followed her into the hotel room.
There are a few things you'd never do to a rancher, and one of them is drink his coffee.
He walked over to her bed and sat down. Besides the covers being moved, there was nothing else in the room. She stared at him. He raised his eyebrows.
What?
Why don't you just come in? She scoffed as she ran her hand through her hair. With each passing minute, she looked more and more awake.
I'm just making sure you don't crawl back into bed.
He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. From the corner of his eye, he saw Christine roll her eyes and limp over to the bathroom. Now alone, he studied the room. The sound of water running filled the silent air. 5 minutes later, she emerged from the bathroom wearing the same things she had the day before.
This is a new walk of shame,
he said, nodding towards a wrinkled business suit. It's the my car broke down and my luggage is still in it walk. She made her way over to her shoes and slipped them on. He nodded.
We can go grab it on our way to the ranch. I called Thomas last night. He owns the town's tow truck. Anyway, he said he'd pick up your car today.
Thanks, she said as she straightened and grabbed her purse and briefcase that were resting on the ground.
Sean stood. Ready to go?
Yep. She opened the door and he went through it. She followed him out of the hall and shut the door. They passed by Ava, who had her chin propped up and eyes closed. Sean tapped the counter, causing her to jump again. She whipped her eyes open and glared at him. "Goodbye, Sean Petty," she said as she waved her hand in his direction.
"Have a great day, Ava,"
he said as he walked through the automatic doors and out into the crisp morning air. He passed by Christine, who was studying him. "You know her?" she asked as she followed behind him.
"We went to high school together."
He walked over to the passenger door and pulled it open. Christine hesitated as she grew closer, but then climbed inside. He shut the door, rounded the hood, and hopped into the driver's side. "Oh, that's nice," she said as she stared out the windshield. "Did you guys, date?" She emphasized the last syllable as if she wasn't sure if she should say something or not.
"Date Ava?"
Sean laughed. That would be like dating his sister, but when he looked over at Christine, he almost wanted to say that it was true. She had a confusing expression on her face. So what if he dated Ava? Why did she care?
"Nah, in her dreams, maybe,"
he said as he wiggled his eyebrows. He shifted his truck into first gear and drove away. "Oh, I just detected some chemistry there," she said. From the corner of his eye, he could see her cheeks redden. What was with her today?
"I grew up with most of the single women around here. If I dated them, it'd be like dating my cousin."
He shook his head.
"Not for me. Curse of living in a town where the population is less than 1,000.
He could feel Christine's stare on him. He wanted to turn and meet her gaze. What was she thinking? That he was a loser? Maybe. Or that only someone who was crazy would voluntarily live in a place with a tiny population. But she didn't understand. He loved this town. And he loved his job. Maybe it was time she started seeing what Moose Falls was all about. He made his way down the highway that led to Austin's ranch. He'd bring her to see Emma. She had a way of calming anyone. Besides, if he was going to convince Christine to be objective when she started the audit, she needed to learn what kind of people she was investigating.
"Do you mind if we stop somewhere before we get your luggage?"
He glanced over at Christine, who turned to look at him. "Sure, where?" Sean settled back in his chair as he rested his wrist on the steering wheel.
"You'll see. I want to introduce you to a few friends. I have a feeling you might just hit it off with one of them."
Christine nodded. "They won't mind that I'm wearing day-old clothes?"
Sean laughed. "Even in day-old clothes, you're better dressed than half the people in this town. I think Emma will be just fine with what you're wearing. Besides, she's pregnant now. I'm sure she'll have some clothes for you to borrow if you want."
"Emma?"
"Yeah, she's married to my buddy. I've been working at his ranch until my cousin leaves my grandpa's ranch. It's helping me save up money for repairs. Anyway, Austin and Emma got married last year. He needed a wife to fully inherit his ranch, so he asked Emma to marry him for the weekend."
He slowed at a stop sign and then took a left.
"But as those stories always go, they fell in love."
"Wow, that's crazy. Sweet, but crazy. I couldn't imagine getting married if it wasn't for real." Sean turned to look at Christine. For the first time since meeting her, she didn't seem like the dragon. Instead, she was a woman simply doing her job. And then his stomach churned at the thought of his livelihood disappearing because of what she was there to do. And the desire to protect himself grew stronger.
"Yeah, someday I'll meet the future Mrs. Petty, but right now it's just not in the cards for me. I work too much to try and start a family, no matter how much I want to."
The emotion in his voice surprised even him. He'd always known he was going to get married. And kids, it was a no-brainer. But he always figured that was a future task for him. He hadn't realized, until he allowed himself to slow down and think about it, how much he wanted it and how soon. Clearing his throat, he flipped on his blinker and turned down Austin's driveway. 3 minutes later, he pulled up to the house and turned the engine off.
"Come on,"
he said, nodding towards Christine. She widened her eyes as she looked out the window. "Isn't it too early? Will they be up?" Sean laughed. Only in the mind of a city girl.
"Yeah, Emma and Austin will be up."
He hopped out of the truck and waved toward the orange streak against the horizon.
and probably pretty angry I'm so late."
Christine unbuckled and climbed out. "Really? Wow. And I thought I got up early."
"Yeah, no, not rancher early."
He made his way across the lawn and up the front steps to the door. He waited for Christine to join him. Once she was next to him, he turned the handle and stepped inside.
"We're here,"
he called, stepping out of the way so that Christine could follow after him.
"We?"
Austin called from the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway with his eyebrows raised.
"Enter late."
He made his way down the hall and extended his hand toward Christine.
"You are?"
Christine met his gesture. "Christine Jordan, or as Sean likes to call me, the Dragon."
Austin snorted. "Really?"
Sean shrugged.
"Hey, tell him why you're here."
He met her gaze and nodded toward Austin. Her eyes widened as she glanced in the direction he'd motioned. "I'm with the IRS."
"She's auditing my pop's ranch," he said, shoving his hands into his front pockets.
In those 5 little words, all the feelings of frustration came rushing back to him. She was here to take away his ranch, something he'd been working like a dog to save.
"Oh."
An uncomfortable look passed across Austin's face.
"I'm sorry."
The air became awkward around them. The need to get out of the room caused Sean to clap Austin on the shoulder.
"Ready to get out of here?"
Right now, he needed to work and not think. Austin nodded.
"Yeah, let's go."
He stepped towards the staircase.
"Em?"
he called. A few seconds later, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs. She had on a bathrobe. "Yeah."
"This is Christine. She's with Sean. Can you hang with her while we go brand some cattle?"
Emma smiled down at them. "Sure, come on up." She waved her hand toward Christine. "I'm getting ready, and with this giant stomach, it takes 10 times as long." Christine hesitated, her gaze falling to Sean. He nodded and motioned for her to move.
"Go ahead. I know it looks like she can devour you, but she won't."
"Whack him for me, Austin." Austin turned and punched him in the shoulder. "Ouch," Sean said, moving away to rub his shoulder. Christine held up her hands. "I'm going before this turns into a brawl."
Sean nodded. "Probably a good idea. I'd wipe the floor with him."
Austin raised his eyebrows.
"Them are fighting words."
Christine was halfway up the stairs, so Sean turned and stuck out his hand.
"Truce?"
Austin nodded.
"Truce."
They shook, and then Austin waved toward the door.
"Let's go get this done."
Chapter 6. Christine. Christine sat on the armchair, feeling awkward. She almost wanted to ask Emma if she could wait for her downstairs, but from the smiles that Emma was giving her, she didn't have the heart. Maybe this was customary in Montana. She didn't want to be rude, so she remained in the corner of Emma's room while she hurried around, getting ready. Well, hurried as much as a gigantic pregnant woman could. Emma paused and smiled over at her. "How do you know Sean?" she asked as she pulled out some concealer. I'm with the IRS." Why did she feel that, as soon as she spoke those words, she would be chased from the house? Those 3 little letters seemed to be the equivalent of a swear word in Montana. Emma lowered her hand. "Oh, really? For the Petty Ranch?" Christine shifted against the chair. "Yeah." She sucked in her breath. "That has to be hard." She returned to her makeup. "Although it does explain the business suit." She waved towards Christine's clothes. "Those don't really speak to a rancher." Christine laughed. "Me? A rancher? No. I rode on Sean's horse yesterday, and that's about all I know about a farm or a ranch." Emma lowered her hand as she glanced over Christine. She was quiet as she studied her. "You know, I felt that way as well, but—" She pulled out a brush and rubbed some powder on her face. "There's something about a Montana man that pulls you in and doesn't let you go." "Seems like it." Christine nodded towards Emma's stomach. She nodded as she reached down and patted it. "I was convinced that I wasn't going to fall for the wiles of a cowboy, and now look at me. I'm a house." Fall for the wiles of a cowboy? Christine swallowed. That was not what she wanted to be thinking about right now. She was here for her job, and that was it. There was no way she could make Montana anything but that. She pushed her hands through her hair and winced.
She was in desperate need of a shower. Problem was she had no idea when that was going to happen. Emma closed her makeup case and stepped away from her dresser. All right, let's get you changed, 'cause there is no way you want to do what we're going to do in that get-up. Christine studied her suit and heels. What are we going to do? Emma smiled. You just wait and see. She pulled open a drawer and rifled around in it. She turned back around with a plaid shirt and jeans. Here. Christine stood and took them. Are you sure? Definitely. It's not like I can wear 'em right now. Thanks. She glanced at the clothes and then back up, hoping what she was about to ask didn't come off as creepy. Do you think I could take a shower here? Emma nodded. Of course. She waved for Christine to follow her. After Emma showed her how to turn on the water, she hung a dry towel on a hook and left. Christine slipped out of her day-old clothes and got in, the hot water hitting her muscles and relaxing her. 15 minutes later, she pulled open the bathroom door, feeling clean and rejuvenated. Even though she showered at the motel last night, wearing her sweaty clothes didn't make her feel very refreshed. This was exactly what she needed. She was surprised to find that not only did Emma's clothes fit her like a glove, they were comfortable, soft and worn in. Emma was nowhere to be found on the upper level, so Christine made her way to the kitchen, where she found Emma with 4 huge bottles. She was filling them with powder and then with water. Getting ready for the baby early? Christine asked as she slipped into one of the stools that was pushed up next to the bar. Emma jumped and turned around. You scared me, she said, holding her hand to her heart. Sorry. That was the last thing Christine needed, scaring a baby right out of Emma. She waved her comment away. It's no biggie. I'm naturally a jumpy person. You should see me with the Disney movies. Christine laughed. She liked Emma. There was a down-to-earth quality to her that told Christine that they could definitely be friends. As she watched Emma screw on a nipple, she stood. Do you need some help? Emma nodded. Sure, the little guys have a hard time waiting. Christine walked over and stood there, not sure what to do. Grab the powder and fill the other bottles. 2 scoops. Christine did as Emma instructed. What is this for? After the bottles were filled and the nipples secured, Emma grabbed one in each arm and nodded to the other 2. If you grab those and follow me, you'll see. Christine cradled each into the crook of her arm and followed Emma over to the door. Slip on a pair of my boots, she said, nodding toward the cowboy boots. When they were ready, Emma balanced a bottle on her hip as she turned the handle of the door and pulled it open. Come on, she called over her shoulder. Christine kept pace with her as they made their way down the porch steps and across the lawn. When they reached the barn, Emma opened the door, and the smell of animals and hay wafted out. The boys will clean the stalls out when they get back, so it's a little stinky in here. But wait until you see what's waiting for us. She made her way over toward the back of the barn. The sound of mooing could be heard from where Christine stood. It wasn't the same animal sound she remembered from the local zoo. It was softer, like a baby. Emma stopped and moved out of her line of vision. There, on the other side of the gate, was a tiny black cow. It was sticking its nose above the top rung, and its giant tongue was sticking out of its mouth. Its wide brown eyes stared at them. When it saw the bottle, it mooed again. Oh my goodness, Christine said, setting the bottles down and reaching out to pat its fur. It wasn't the same hide that she remembered from the adult cow she petted last year when she went to the farm with her niece. It was softer. Christine, meet Grouch, Emma said. Hi, Grouch. The calf mooed in response and moved so that it could lick her hand. You feed these babies? She asked, turning to see all the calves that were peeking up over their gates. Yeah, I don't do branding. I get the best job. Loving all these cuties. Their mamas died in the storm a few months ago. Since then, I've taken care of them. Emma set a bottle down and made her way over to Grouch's neighbor. She tipped the bottle towards its lips and happily took it. You want to feed 'em? She asked, nodding toward the bottles. Christine wiped her hands on her jeans and reached up to braid her hair. Once it was secure, she grabbed a bottle and nodded. Of course. Grouch mooed in protest,
and as soon as she tipped the nipple toward him, he sucked it in. They stood in silence while the cows drank the milk. She glanced over at Emma, who was watching the calf. "Are you having fun with Sean?" she asked, her focus remaining on the bottle. Fun? She wasn't sure she'd categorize her time with Sean as fun. Confusing, yes. But fun? Was investigating a family for dishonesty fun? No. And the truth was, the longer she spent around Sean, the more confused she got. How was she supposed to go through his records and dig up dirt? Especially when she was also learning that he might be a good guy. Yeah, Sean's a great guy. He works hard, ever since. Her voice trailed off. Christine glanced over at her. That was the second person that started talking about Sean, but then didn't finish. She wanted to know what he was hiding. Ever since what? Emma patted the calf's head. When he was a senior in high school, he was at his grandfather's ranch helping out. He got kicked by a cow in his right shoulder. Christine winced at the thought. That had to hurt. Yeah, hurt. It also ruined his chances of keeping his scholarship from Purdue. He lost it all. Scholarship? Emma turned to look at her. He's a swimmer, was. He hasn't gotten into the water since then. She pulled the now empty bottle from the calf, who protested loudly. Christine looked down to see if the grouch had emptied his bottle as well. All because a cow kicked him? Emma set the bottle down on the ground and grabbed a full one. Yeah, I guess it's just hard for him. It was all his dad wanted him to do. Go to Purdue, become a lawyer. His dad has a firm in Great Falls. He'd planned on doing it, but then he got hurt. His dad is pretty hard on him because, despite that, he chose the rancher life. Christine studied the opening of the barn. The sky streaked with yellow and orange as the sun began to rise above the horizon. Somewhere out there, Sean was doing whatever ranchers did to brand cows. Personally, she thought it sounded barbaric, and she was glad they were doing it far away from her. Emma's words rolled around in her mind as she thought of Sean's face. His goofy grin, or the way he made her laugh, or scream, caused butterflies to erupt in her stomach. If she were honest with herself, she wanted to see him again. She wanted to talk to him. And she wanted him to tell her all the things Emma had told her. She wanted to hear it from him. If that happened, then it meant he trusted her. And for some reason right now, she wanted him to trust her. It wasn't until after 10 that Austin and Sean came pulling up to the house. They were both in four-wheelers and were covered with mud. Christine tried to still her emotions as she followed Emma out of the house and onto the front porch. "There's my loving wife," Austin said, pulling his helmet off his head and setting it on the four-wheeler. He was up the steps in 2 seconds and bent down for a kiss. Christine dropped her gaze, but not before she snuck a look at Sean. He was watching her, but as soon as her gaze met his, he looked away. "Did you girls keep busy while we were gone?" Austin asked, once he'd righted Emma. He glanced to Christine and then back to his wife. "Yup, Christine got to feed the babies for the first time. She's a natural." Emma smiled over at her. "It's easy when they're so cute," Christine said. Heat burned her cheeks as everyone's attention fell to her. "Lunch?" Emma asked, glancing around. "We should head back. Christine needs to get started on the audit," Sean said, stepping forward. Right. That was what she was here to do, not play with calves or get to know Sean's friends. She was here to audit his grandfather's ranch, with the potential of shutting them down. She needed to get her head on straight. But as she thought the words, she couldn't help the feeling of frustration that built up inside of her. Sure, she'd gotten emotionally involved. She was human. She wasn't a robot just doing what she was told. As her gaze met Sean's, her heart picked up speed. One thing she knew for sure, she would help him in any way she could. "Mind if I borrow these clothes?" she asked, waving towards Emma's shirt and jeans. Emma nodded. "Of course not. I'm not going to need them any time soon." "Thanks." Emma smiled and then reached both arms out and drew her into a big hug. "Certainly, just know you're welcome here any time." Christine pulled back and nodded. That means a lot. She liked Emma, a lot. There was something about her that was relatable. Maybe it was the fact that she was an outsider, a person who'd picked Moose Falls as a place to stay. "Ready?" Sean called up at her. Christine nodded and headed down the stairs. "Oh, before I forget, are you all coming tomorrow? The tavern is hosting a barn dance," Emma said, wriggling her eyebrows at Sean. "You should bring Christine. It would be fun." Christine opened her lips to say that sounded fun, but Sean's snort cut her words short. "Christine doesn't want to go to a barn dance. Besides, she has too much to do." He nodded towards her. "Right?" Her chest squeezed at his words. He seemed quick to respond. Did he really not want her to go? She knew that he hated her being here, but she thought that they'd had a connection last night at Susan's diner. She'd allowed herself to think that perhaps he was seeing her as someone more than the lady who was just there to crush his rancher dreams. Apparently not. She grabbed her purse and clothes that she'd placed by the front door, and then made her way down the porch steps. Sean had already made his way toward the truck and opened his door. Christine waved to Emma and then climbed in after him. As he started up his truck and pulled out, Christine let the thought that she'd pushed to the back of her mind resurface. This cowboy would never see her as someone other than the IRS lady, the one to come and shut down his ranch. And no matter how much she wanted to get to know him, that was just one obstacle he wouldn't be able to get past. She should stop hoping and just focus on the audit. It was the smartest thing she could do. For her job and Sean, and her sanity. But that wasn't a thought she was going to allow right now. Now if she wanted to leave Moose Falls, unaffected by its charms. Chapter 7. Sean. Sean kept his focus on the road and not on Christine, who sat quietly next to him. She seemed preoccupied, keeping her gaze outside of the truck. When he'd pulled the four-wheeler up to Austin's house and seen Christine in the plaid shirt and jeans standing next to Emma, his heart had about stopped. She looked so at ease, like she belonged there. And for a moment, he'd wondered what it would feel like if she were there for him, and not for the audit. But then reality raced back, sending his thoughts to a screeching halt. Feeling stupid, he gripped the steering wheel and narrowed his eyes. How could he let this woman distract him like this? She was the last person in the world that he should be having those thoughts about. It must be exhaustion that was clouding his mind. That was all. "Have fun with Emma?" he asked. He needed to do something to keep his mind busy, especially since it kept slipping back to how amazing she looked when her gaze had fallen on him. How her nose had crinkled and a small dimple appeared next to her pink lips as she smiled at him from the front porch. And how much his head hurt as he tried to figure out what that all meant. She sighed next to him. The sound was soft and feminine, but was enough to bring him back to reality. It was amazing. Emma is awesome. She paused, and from the corner of his eye he could see her turn and look at him. "Thanks for introducing me to her. I'm starting to see..." Her voice trailed off as she turned her attention back to the window. Why hadn't she finished her sentence? He leaned closer to her. Had he missed the rest of it? "Starting to see what?" He glanced over at her to see that her gaze had dropped to her hands in her lap. "Why, this is such an amazing place." His heart swelled as he clenched his jaw. She thought Moose Falls was amazing? "Really?" Christine peered over at him. "The people are nice, it's small and homey. I can see why you like it." He cleared his throat, hoping to dispel the emotions that seemed as if they were choking him. For as much backlash as he got from his family about staying, felt strange to hear someone understand why, especially from an outsider. She was a city girl, but she had witnessed what Moose Falls had to offer. "Yeah, and can you see why I don't want to leave?" He studied her, hoping she'd understand his meaning. Christine met his gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I can see that." He swallowed again as he drew his attention back to the road. 15 minutes later, Christine's rental car came into view. Thomas, the town's tow truck driver, was walking around the car and hooking it up. Sean pulled in behind it, grateful for the opportunity to get out of the truck. He needed some space from Christine right now. She was confusing him, and it made him feel uncomfortable. When Christine moved to unbuckle her seatbelt, Sean put up his hand. "I'll grab it." She hesitated, but then settled back into her chair. It's in the trunk. Sean nodded and pulled on the door handle. Thomas glanced behind him as Sean walked up. Hey, Sean, he said as he pressed on the lever next to him. The front part of her car began to rise. Thanks for grabbing this, man, he said, extending his hand. They shook. Thomas nodded. No problem. Sorry it took me so long to get out here. Sean waved his comment away. Do you mind me grabbing something from the trunk? Nope. Sean walked over to the driver's side door and pulled it open. Once he'd popped the trunk, he walked around and grabbed her suitcase. Just as he slipped it out, the top flopped open and all the contents dumped onto the ground. Lacy underwear and pressed shirts spilled all over the dirt road. Sean's face burned as he stooped down to pick them up. He heard the door of the truck open and could only assume it was Christine rushing over to help. I'm so sorry, she said, grabbing the clothes and stuffing them back into her luggage. My fault, he said. His voice came out raspy. Clearing his throat, he decided not to focus on what holding her underwear was doing to his body parts. Once all the clothes were safely in the suitcase, Christine zipped it up and grabbed the handle. She lifted it and started to make her way over to the truck. Sean quickened his pace to catch up with her. He reached out and curled his fingers around the handle. Here, let me help, he said, trying to ignore how soft her skin felt when he brushed his fingers against it. Christine stopped and turned to meet his gaze. She dropped the suitcase as if their brief encounter surprised her. Did that mean she felt something too? Was it just him? Okay, she said as she turned and made her way over to the truck and climbed into it. She slammed the door just as he dropped her suitcase inside the bed of his truck and opened the driver's door. He started his truck, trying to ignore what had happened. How could he be such an idiot? Why was he letting himself get close to this IRS auditor? He needed to remind himself of what she was here to do. She was here to take away his ranch. He shouldn't be getting feelings for her. They drove in silence all the way back to the ranch. He pulled up to the back of the house and turned off the truck. Christine reached out her hand and fingered the door handle. Thanks for getting my luggage for me. It'll be nice to wear some of my clothes. He looked over at her, cursing himself for thinking about how good she looked in Emma's shirt and jeans. For a moment it felt like she belonged here, but then he stifled a scoff and pushed those thoughts from his mind. She would never stay in Moose Falls. She was going to come and go faster than rain during the drought. Come on, let's go. There are papers for you to sort, and knowing my pops, it's not going to be easy. He was never a bookkeeper kind of guy. Sean pulled open his door and hopped out. He went over to the bed and pulled out her suitcase. By the time he'd rounded the truck, Christine was standing next to it, watching him. There was something in her gaze, a look that made him uncomfortable. He forced a relaxed smile as he passed her. He could hear the gravel crunch under her feet as she followed after him. The silence that surrounded them felt deafening. He decided to focus on something else. Getting her inside the house and starting the audit seemed like the best idea. He jogged up the porch steps and opened the screen door. Once inside the foyer, he set the suitcase down on the floor and slipped off his shoes. We're home, Pop, he called out. He shifted his gaze toward the back of the house. Where was he? With his health issues, Pop wasn't able to go to work on the ranch alone. Panic arose in Sean's chest as he started to make his way over to the stairs. But the sight of his grandfather sitting in the rocking chair in the living room stopped him in his tracks. He made his way into the room and his heart squeezed in his chest when he saw what his grandfather was holding. A picture of Sean's grandmother, who died a year ago. Hey, Pops, he said as he approached and knelt down next to him. He reached out and rested his hand on his grandfather's weather-worn one. You okay? His grandfather looked over at him. There was pain in his expression and a downturn to his lips. Sean swallowed as he patted his grandfather's hand. I know, he said, emotion choking his throat. Even though his pops hadn't said anything, Sean knew what the problem was. His grandfather would have done anything to keep the cancer from taking her life. Anything. I miss her, Pops said, his voice breaking. Sean nodded. Me too. Movement next to him drew his attention over to the entrance of the room. Christine had removed her boots and was leaning against the door frame. She was watching them, her eyebrows drawn together. Sean stood and walked over toward her. He was conflicted. Part of him wanted to share the portion of his life with her, for her to know just how broken his family had become once his grandmother had passed away. The other part told him to protect himself, to keep her at a distance. There was no reason she should learn all of this about him. She was here for a job and then would leave to go back to Washington, D.C. So he let his hand graze her elbow as he led her away from his grandfather's reverie.
"Come on, let's get you the boxes so you can get started," he said as he extended his hand toward the study at the end of the hall.
Christine allowed him to guide her. "Is your grandpa okay?" she asked as her gaze made its way back to the living room.
"Yeah, he'll be okay. Just memories."
Sean swallowed against the emotional lump that had formed in his throat. Memories. Her voice came out soft as if she understood without him saying the words.
"Yeah, not really something I like to talk about."
He pulled open the door to the study and nodded toward the desk that sat in the center of the room.
"You can set up shop here."
He rubbed the back of his neck with his hand. The walls felt as if they were closing in on him. He needed to get outside to the sunshine and fresh air, where everything made sense. Christine walked into the study and glanced around. The walls were adorned with pictures. As he watched her make her way over to them and study the photographs, all he wanted to do was shoo her from the room. She was rapidly learning too many things about him, secret things, memories that he wanted to share only with people who cared about him, who weren't here to take away the very thing that he loved. So many conflicting emotions raced through his mind and body. He needed to get out of there.
"I'll go grab the boxes,"
he said, backing up toward the hallway. Christine nodded. Once he was out of her line of sight, he sighed. He really needed to get his head on straight. There was no reason for him to be acting like this. He just needed some distance from her. That was all. Thankfully, once he got the boxes down from the attic, he'd get that time. There was so much work to do around the ranch that he wasn't going to have any time to think about anything, much less an aggravating auditor that had his head spinning. After digging around in the attic, he found all the receipts and documents packed away in boxes. When he opened the lid, he shuffled a few around. The dates ranged from last year to 5 years ago. He winced at how disorganized his grandfather had been. Their bookkeeping was definitely going to give Christine a run for her money. But that's why she was here. Grabbing all the boxes he could locate, he brought them down one at a time. Then he made his way to the study where he dropped off the first box. Christine was sitting in the desk chair, staring out the window. When he came in, she glanced over at him and stood. "This all?" she asked, lifting the lid of the box. "It doesn't look too bad."
Sean snorted. "This is just the first box. I have 5 more coming."
Christine's eyes widened. 5?
"They're all intermingled with each other," he said as he waved his hand toward the box and made his way back down the hall. If she protested, he didn't hear. When the 6th box was finally unloaded, Sean clapped his hands. "Well, I'm going to head out to do some work. You go ahead and get started."
He gestured toward the kitchen.
"Feel free to help yourself to whatever's in there. There's not much, but you should be able to scrap something together."
She followed his gesture toward the kitchen. "Are you not coming back for lunch?" He shook his head.
"Don't have time. Got lots to do. I probably won't be back until tonight."
He turned to make his way out of the room, but then stopped.
"Are you going to be okay?"
He was nervous about leaving this woman alone in his grandfather's house. What was she going to do? Could he really trust her? Christine pinched her lips together and nodded. "I think I'll be fine. Besides, I've got tons of work here." She moved her hand around in the air above the boxes. Sean looked at her once more and then nodded.
"Okay, I might stop by in a few hours just to make sure everything's okay."
She waved him away. "Not necessary. I probably won't leave this room. Once I'm in the zone, I'm in the zone." She held up a stack of papers and began rifling through them. Before he went ahead and said something stupid, Sean turned and left the room. He grabbed his keys from the table in the hallway. Pops was fast asleep in his rocking chair when Sean peeked into the room. Before he could talk himself out of leaving, Sean pulled open the front door and bounded down the stairs. It was time he started working. He was so behind. He needed to stop letting Christine distract him as much as she was. He needed to focus, not lose sight of what was really important. Keeping his ranch, that was all that mattered, and he'd make sure that it stayed that way. Chapter 8. Christine. Christine sighed as she rested against the desk chair. It rocked back from her weight. The ache that had taken up residence in her neck didn't dull. Desperate for some relief, she reached up and rubbed her shoulder. As she glanced out the window, her eyes widened. The sun was already below the horizon, sending orange and pink streaking across the sky. She gazed at the clock on the wall. 7 o'clock? She shuffled the stacks of paper and stood. Her legs protested as she tried to force life back into them. How had she worked for 8 hours straight? When her gaze fell to the 2 open boxes, she sighed. That's how she'd lost track of time. Sean's grandfather was a lot of things, but organized was not one of them. He had so much information packed into those 6 boxes that she hadn't really known where to start. So instead of driving herself mad, she started to organize the papers by dates. That had taken up most of her time. She walked out of the study and into the hallway. After she pulled the door shut behind her, she swept her gaze around. Where was everyone? Her socks made no noise against the dark wood floor as she made her way toward the kitchen. It was eerily quiet here. No police sirens going off, no rush of evening traffic. The sound of crickets outside was the only thing that broke up the silence. She made her way over to the fridge and pulled it open. There wasn't much inside. Some meat and eggs. A squishy apple sat in the back. Christine wriggled her nose as she shut the door. None of this was going to work. Besides, if she were completely honest with herself, she was a terrible cook. What looked like a meal waiting to be put together to someone else only looked like odds and ends to her. That's an interesting expression. Sean's deep, playful voice caused her to jump. Turning, she saw him leaning against the doorframe. He was watching her with a smile teasing his lips. His hair was damp. He had on a t-shirt that accented his tan skin and muscular arms. Heat instantly rose to her cheeks when she realized that she was staring. Trying to come across as a normal person, she smiled over at him. Just trying to figure out what to make, she said, pulling open a cupboard only to realize that it was full of canning jars. Just not in there, she said under her breath. Yeah, there isn't a lot you can make with the jars, he said. From the corner of her eye, she saw him push off the wall and walk into the kitchen. Well, Morse sauntered in, as if he owned the place, which he did. What was the matter with her? She should not be thinking any of the thoughts that were rolling around in her mind. He was the client, getting investigated. That was all. She needed to remember that. He pulled out the bar stool from the counter and patted the cushion. Why don't you take a seat and let the master work? Christine studied the seat. Part of her wanted to run from the room, to leave this place and all the confusing cowboys that lived here. The other part wanted to see just what exactly he would whip up from a soft apple and meat. So she shrugged and sat. This should be interesting. Sean moved over to the fridge, where he studied her. What should be interesting? She motioned toward the fridge, seeing what you can make from the contents in there. Sean laughed as he pulled out the eggs and steak. Oh, ye of little faith. This is something my granny always taught me. On the ranch, all you need is a few good staples and you can make just about anything. Christine studied him as a forlorn look passed over his face. Something had happened in this family and she had a suspicion that it had something to do with his grandmother. From the way his grandfather had been holding the picture frame earlier, she must have passed away. Was it strange that she wanted to know what that was? Would it be weird to ask? Perhaps she should take a less direct route. She smiled and rested her arm on the counter. She sounds like quite the woman. Sean had grabbed some flour from the cupboard next to the stove and nodded. She was. Then he pinched his lips together as he hadn't meant to say that. A familiar ache rose up in Christine's chest. She knew what it was like to lose someone close to her. Both sets of her grandparents had passed away in the last 5 years. "I'm sorry," she whispered as she traced the countertop with her fingertips. Sean set the flour next to the meat and swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down as if he too were trying to keep his emotions at bay.
"Yeah,"
he cleared his throat. "It was hard." Christine's heart swelled from his confession. For the first time since she'd gotten here, she felt as if he were opening up to her, and that made her both excited and scared. She wanted to learn more, to speak openly with him. Was that too much to ask? "How's your grandpa taking it?" Sean paused and glanced over at her, and then toward the living room.
"It's hard for him. They'd been married since he was 19.
Christine raised her eyebrows. "Wow, that's young." Sean shrugged as he got out a bowl.
"Back then it wasn't. Besides, when you're in love, you're in love. There's really not much to it."
He set the bowls down in front of him, then returned to the fridge and removed a jug of milk. If only it were that simple. Trouble was, Christine was having a hard time finding anyone who wanted to love her back. She had just enough heartbreak to swear dating and marriage off completely. Before her head caught up with her mouth, she blurted out, "Have you ever been in love like that?" Just as the words left her lips, her heart began to pound. How could she be such an idiot? I mean... But then she clamped her mouth shut. There was really no redeeming herself from that question. Sean was dumping flour into a bowl when he glanced up at her.
"Are you asking me if I've ever been married, or if I've been in a love like that?"
Thankful that he hadn't written her off as an idiot, Christine sat back on the bar stool. "Both?" Sean cracked some eggs into another bowl.
"Neither. Moose Falls isn't exactly bursting at the seams with eligible women. And if you go into the city, not a lot of women want to give up their cushy lifestyle to be a rancher's wife."
He grabbed a whisk and began beating the eggs. Christine watched the movement. It mesmerized her. On one hand, she understood what he was saying. It was a different world out here. It was alive. It breathed and beat to its own rhythm. But that was what was so amazing about it. "I didn't understand, but I think I'm starting to," she confessed, keeping her gaze trained on the counter in front of her. When Sean didn't reply, she looked over at him. Had she said the wrong thing? Just her luck, she'd scared him off. Maybe this was what Parker had meant when he told her she dove into her assignments head first. That she allowed herself to care too much for those she was auditing. Braving his reaction, Christine lifted her gaze to meet his. He was studying her with a confused look on his face, like he was trying to figure her out. Truth was, she wasn't too complicated. When her gaze met his, he held it for a moment before he cleared his throat and turned his focus back to the eggs in front of him.
"Have you ever had chicken fried steak?"
he asked as he returned to whip the contents of the bowl. "Once," she said. "My grandpa grew up in the South. He made it for me when I stayed with him." Sean nodded.
"Good. I'm going to make you some."
He glanced up at her as he nodded toward the steak that was sitting on the counter.
"But from where I come from, everyone helps."
Christine laughed. "You don't understand. I'm the worst cook." Sean shook his head.
"Then it's a good thing you aren't cooking. I need you to pound the meat."
"You want me to what?" Sean set the bowl and whisk down on the counter and pulled open a drawer to reveal a mallet.
"This is what you use,"
he said, waving over her. Christine hesitated. How was she going to get him to understand that this really was a bad idea? He laughed a soulful laugh. His eyes crinkled at the sides, and his lips parted, showing perfectly straight teeth. Was he laughing at her? She pushed away from the counter and made her way over to him. For some reason, his laughing bugged her. She knew she was a bad cook, but it wasn't like he had experience with it. She stood next to him and reached for the mallet. Even though every time she'd tried to hang a picture, she ended up hitting her thumb more times than the nail, she wasn't going to let this cowboy think she couldn't hammer a steak. "So how does one do this?" she asked, waving it toward him. Sean grabbed the package of meat and unwrapped it. He laid it down on the counter, covered it with wax paper, and motioned toward it.
You take the mallet and begin whacking it. You hit it until it's flat.
Christine stared at the steak and then the mallet. That sounded easy enough. She raised the mallet and brought it down, striking the steak. It mocked her as it bounced back. Okay, maybe this wasn't as easy as she thought it was going to be. Sean laughed again. Christine shot him her most menacing glare. Why do you keep doing that? Sean pretended to wipe a tear from his eye.
You act all tough, but if we were depending on your ability to hit meat, we'd starve.
Christine attempted to hit the meat again, only to end up with the same result. I'm hitting it, but nothing's happening. Suddenly, the feeling of Sean's arms around her stopped her in her tracks. She breathed in as he pressed against her back. He grabbed her hands and brought up the one that was holding the mallet.
You need to hit it harder,
he said. His voice was breathy against her ear and sent shivers down her spine. Did he notice what his close proximity was doing to her? Her mind was clouded and her knees felt like jello. She held onto the counter in front of her with all her strength. If he backed away now, she was pretty sure she'd collapse to the floor. He raised the mallet and brought it down. The meat didn't bounce back in a mocking jolt. Instead, with each swift swing, it began to flatten. After a minute, Sean stopped and dropped her hands.
Make sense?
He asked and then cleared his throat. Christine just peered over at him. He'd moved over to the stove where he got out a cast iron skillet and placed it on the burner. After lighting the burner and filling the pan with oil, he turned around. Embarrassment flooded her skin as she turned back and began hitting the meat, each time with more force. Finally, it was flattened uniformly, so Sean took it and began to bread it. While he fried it in the pan, Christine began working on the next one. She hadn't noticed that he'd come back until he spoke.
So, how about you? Have you ever had any of those love-no-matter-what relationships?
He had his hands crossed and was leaning his hip against the counter. Christine glanced over at him as she swung the mallet up. The playful expression on his face caused her to lose her focus for a minute. Just as she brought it down, she winced and yelped. She'd brought the mallet down on her finger. Sean was to her side in a moment, grabbing her hand and looking at her injury.
You okay?
He asked as he inspected it. Christine winced as the throbbing pain shot up her arm, but the feeling of his hand wrapped around hers was conflicting with the ache coming from her nail. I think so, she breathed out. Sean motioned for her to follow him to the sink. He flipped on the faucet and stuck her hand underneath. The cool water shocked her system.
Let me get you some ice,
he said as he walked over to the freezer and pulled open the door. After he put a few ice cubes in the bag, he turned off the water and motioned to the bar stool she'd left earlier.
Why don't you have a seat and I'll finish up?
Grateful for the opportunity to get away from the meat and Sean's close proximity, Christine nodded and did what he said. Once she settled in, Sean started smacking the meat. In record time, the steak was flat and breaded and sizzling in the frying pan. While it cooked, Sean pulled out a pot and got it heating. Christine spent the whole time just watching him, trying to figure him out. He seemed so rough on the outside, but when it came to things that mattered, he was different. From his reaction to her hitting her finger to the care he showed his grandfather earlier, all of it intrigued her, drew her in, made her want to know more about this cowboy, and that scared her. She swallowed as she dropped her gaze and focused on the ice cubes that were resting on her finger. It was time she got her head on straight, before she did something she'd regret. Something she might not be able to come back from. Self-preservation was the smartest thing for her, and she needed to protect herself now, before it was too late. Chapter 9. Sean. Sean welcomed the silence that setting the table brought him. Christine had decided to focus on nursing her fingernail rather than paying attention to him. He was thankful for that. He wasn't quite ready to digest what happened earlier. From wrapping his arms around her to show her how to pound the meat, to running her finger underneath the water, all of it had his senses going haywire. It seemed prudent to put as much space between him and Christine as possible. Once the plates and silverware were set,
He walked back into the kitchen where he removed the gravy from the stove. "You ready to eat?" he asked, nodding toward Christine. She looked up at him, and for a moment an expression passed over her face. He wasn't quite sure what it meant. He wanted to ask but feared what she might say, so he brushed it off and smiled over at her. "You're in luck. My grandmother's chicken fried steak is the best in the country." He lifted the platter and gravy. Christine slipped off the stool and nodded. "I'm excited to try it." She followed after him into the dining room. Once the food was dished up, Sean made his way over to the stairs and took them 2 at a time. Pops normally took an afternoon nap. He always slept late, and Sean had to wake him up. He got to his grandfather's bedroom and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, he opened the door. "Pops?" There was a grunt from the direction of the bed. "Sean?" "Yup, dinner's ready." There were a few more grunts, followed by a few curse words. Finally, Pops emerged from the shadows. His hair stuck up on one side and his face was bright red. "Thanks," he said as he passed by Sean and headed down the stairs. Sean nodded and followed after his grandfather. When Pops walked into the dining room, he stopped to stare at Christine. "You're still here?" he asked, taking a seat at the head of the table. She was mid-drink, so she just nodded. Once she'd swallowed and set her glass down, she turned to look at him. "Yeah, kind of my job." Sean's stomach twisted at her words, which was ridiculous because he knew that was why she was here. It was her job and nothing else. Pops grunted as he grabbed his fork and knife and started to dig in. "Pops, prayer," Sean said. His grandfather rolled his eyes and dropped his utensils. "It's like your granny's here again." Sean nodded. True, she'd been the stickler about saying grace, but ever since she passed, Sean made sure that they said it. If what she'd lectured about heaven and hell were true, then he'd err on the side of caution and say the prayers. Once grace was said, they started eating. Silence fell around them as the clinking of silverware against the dishes replaced the talking. When about half of Christine's plate was gone, she placed her utensils down on the table and glanced around. That was amazing. Sean was mid-bite, so he simply nodded. "I honestly don't think I could eat another bite." Pops grunted. "You should. You're what, $1.20?" He waved his fork in her direction. Her cheeks hinted pink as she nodded. Sean leaned over. "Don't be embarrassed. Pops was an animal auctioneer. He got good at guessing weight." "It's like a sixth sense," Pop said as he put another piece of steak into his mouth. "So are you staying here?" Christine choked on the water she'd just drunk. Wiping her chin with her hand, she shook her head. "No, I'm not staying here. I'm at the Moose Falls Motel." "That dump? No," he said, shaking his head. Sean leaned over. He wasn't sure if he liked where this conversation was going. "Pops, it's fine. The motel's nice now that Ava's family took it over." Pops looked over at him and shook his head. "Why is she staying there? She should be here. Besides, it's a lot of wasted time to have her driving a half hour into town and a half hour back." He shook his head as he sawed off another piece of steak. "It's settled. You're staying here. Besides, we're going to fatten you up." Sean almost feared her expression when he peered over at her. Thankfully, she looked a little uneasy, but when she met his gaze, she gave him a small smile and shrugged. "I guess if he insists. Besides, I do have my luggage here." Sean's heart picked up speed as he thought about Christine staying here, in his house, sleeping in one of his beds. He cleared his throat as he pushed out all the images that had accumulated from those thoughts. And why did she seem so cool about it? Was it just him that was having all these confusing and distracting encounters with her? It must be. "Perfect," he said. If she was okay with it, then he'd be as well. "I'll set up the guest bedroom for you." It almost seemed as if Christine's cool demeanor faltered for a moment before a smile replaced her uneasy expression. "Great, I can't wait." "Don't get your excitement up, it's not the Ritz," he said as he wiped his mouth with his napkin. Christine shook her head. "I'm sure it will be lovely." Pop shrugged as he took a drink of water. See it first and then make your decision. Christine raised her eyebrows. Sean placed his fork and knife down. Right now? I'd love to get some sleep. I'm exhausted, she said as she pushed away from the table. Sean nodded and scooted out of his chair. Sounds good. He tapped the table, drawing Pop's attention over. I'll be right back. Pops waved him away. I'll be fine, you go. Sean glanced over at Christine, who was pushing her chair in. He extended his arm, motioning for her to go ahead. When they made their way out into the hall, Christine turned, bumping right into him. Out of instinct, he wrapped his arms around her to steady her. He tried to ignore how her hands rested on his chest. Did she feel his heart pounding? Did it give him away? Sorry, she breathed as she raised her gaze to meet his. He knew he should drop his arms, that he should back away. Just give her the directions and get the heck out of here, he screamed in his mind. But no amount of cursing could get him to move. The feeling of her body pressed against his was sending electric jolts down his body. It was as if she fit in his arms, like she was meant to be there. Sean, she said, peering into his eyes. He drew his focus back to her. Yeah? I think you can let me go now. I'm not going to fall down. As if that were the key to his release, Sean dropped his arms and took a step back. He ran his hands through his hair as red-hot embarrassment coursed through him. What an idiot he was. Hugging the auditor? Sorry, he muttered. Christine adjusted her shirt as she shook her head. No problem, it was my fault, really. I should have warned you that I was taking a detour. Thankful that she was focusing on her, Sean looked around. Yeah, what was that about? She waved toward the front door. I was trying to grab my suitcase. Suddenly remembering that she'd left it there, Sean walked over and reached for the handle. Let me. I can't, they said at the same time. He peered down at her, hoping she would see the desperation in his gaze. He really needed a job right now. Something that would help keep his mind off of what had just happened moments ago. Christine held up her hands. Perfect, thanks. He shot her a smile and then nodded toward the suitcase. We're going up. Christine followed. Once they got to the top of the stairs, Sean walked past his bedroom. He contemplated telling her it was his, but then thought against it. Did she really need to know where he slept? So which is your room? Her quiet voice asked from behind him. Too late. It would be weird if he didn't tell her now. When he glanced behind him, he saw that her cheeks had reddened. I mean, if there's a fire or something, and I need to save you. Sean laughed. You save me? $1.20? He shook his head. It's better if you just let me die. I would just weigh you down. Her lips parted. I don't think the government would feel the same way. Then she dropped her voice and said, and Parker would really have a reason to fire me. He quirked his eyebrow. Who was Parker? She sighed. He's my boss. I didn't say this to you, but this is my last opportunity to prove my value to the government. If I'm not successful, she motioned to her throat, I get cut. Cut? Fired. Sean sucked in his breath. Ouch, he said as he stopped outside of the guest room and nodded toward the inside. He had no idea just what was at stake for her as well. Maybe he had been unfair with how he'd been treating her. But she was here to challenge his ranch. He needed to remember that. No matter how clouded his mind was right now, she was the dragon, plain and simple. So instead of standing there feeling completely confused, he decided that it was best to finish up with the tour and get away from her. Bathroom's down the hall. My room is the one we just passed. Pop's is the door right there. He leaned closer to her but then cursed himself for doing it. If there's a fire, do me a favor, save him first. He peered into her gaze, taking note of the soft blues and flecks of gold. Christine's eyes widened as she nodded. Okay, she breathed. He met her gaze one more time before he stepped away. I'll see you in the morning, he called over his shoulder. If you can handle it. He heard her scoff from behind him. What's that supposed to mean? He laughed as he paused at the top of the stairs. It means that a rancher and an auditor are two very different things. She folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe.
So you're saying that I couldn't handle being a rancher? He couldn't help the laugh that rumbled in his chest.
I'm not saying it. It's a fact.
She narrowed her eyes. We'll see about that.
Okay, you have to get up early first,
he said as he made his way down the stairs. He could hear her protest, but by the time he reached the foyer, the upstairs was silent. He could only assume that she'd gone into her room and shut the door. When Sean made his way into the dining room, Pops was nowhere to be seen. He must have gone out for his ritual coffee on the porch, something he and Gran used to do every day. He stacked the dirty dishes on top of each other, then he brought them into the kitchen, where he started rinsing them. He welcomed the monotony that doing the dishes brought him. It helped clear his mind. As he finished wiping down the counter, the phone rang. He set the towel down and walked over to the wall.
Hello?
He asked.
Sean?
His dad's gravelly voice came from the other side of the call. He sighed as he leaned against the counter.
What do you want, Dad?
Silence filled the phone. Sean winced. He didn't mean to come across as short, but right now the last thing he needed was his father stepping in and confusing him even more.
Sorry, long day,
he said, hoping to backpedal. His dad cleared his throat.
Is it the IRS auditor?
Sean peered upstairs. Well, that was a conversation he definitely didn't want to have with his dad.
Something like that. The auditor, the ranch, Pops. What's wrong with your grandfather? I found him holding Gran's picture again.
His father sighed, this time with much more irritation.
You're supposed to keep an eye on him. That was something you said you'd do, that you could handle it.
Heat raced up Sean's spine. He wanted to say that he was trying his hardest, that he couldn't control what his grandfather did, but his dad wasn't interested in excuses. He only wanted results.
Yup, Dad, I know. You assured me that this was what you wanted, and you knew what the job entailed when you took it on.
He let his words linger in the air.
I know.
Sean fought the groan that grew in his throat. If only he could say the words on the tip of his tongue, but telling his dad off wasn't going to solve anything. His dad clicked his tongue.
Good, I'm glad we cleared that up. Now make sure you do what you have to do in order to get this auditor on his way, so everything can go back to normal.
Sean folded one arm across his chest and rested his elbow on his hand.
What does that mean? It means, Sean, that when you're a business person, you need to do what has to be done to get results. You don't help with the audit. You give them the information and have them figure it out for themselves. Keep them from being distracted so they can get out of there faster. If there's anything your grandfather has been hiding, it's their responsibility to find it, not yours. This conversation was rapidly making Sean feel more and more uncomfortable, especially since Christine's face kept flashing in his mind along with her earlier confession that her job was on the line too. And if he were honest with himself, he was torn between saving his ranch and helping Christine, even though it felt strange to admit. Why couldn't both sides benefit? Maybe if he did help, they could figure everything out, protect the ranch and satisfy the government. Was it too much to hope? Desperate to get off the phone with his dad, he turned his attention back to the receiver. Got it, Dad. I'll get it done.
His dad cleared his throat.
Good to hear. I should go. I've got an early morning.
We'll talk soon? Not if Sean could help it.
Sure, I'll talk to you soon.
Good night.
Night.
Chapter 10. Sean. Sean's alarm blared too soon the next morning. Groaning, he reached over and hit the snooze button. 10 more minutes and then he'd get up. Just as he slipped back to sleep, the alarm rang again. Time to get up. He pulled the covers off of his lap and sat up. He swung his feet over the side of the bed and opened his door. He needed a shower. They always woke him up. When he got to the bathroom, he jiggled the handle. Locked. He cursed under his breath. Hopefully Pops hadn't barricaded himself in the bathroom again. He raised his hand to knock. Before his knuckles made contact, the door opened and Christine's bright blue eyes peered over at him. Sean took a step back as his gaze roamed over her damp hair, down her long neck, and to the top of her towel that she'd wrapped around her body. He swallowed as he forced his gaze up to meet hers. Her eyes were just as wide as he caught her staring at his chest. Suddenly he remembered that he was standing there in only a pair of pajama bottoms. Never in his life had he felt more exposed, especially when her gaze lingered on the raised tissue of his scar on his shoulder. Her gaze made its way up to his. Heat rushed across his skin as he peered into her eyes. She seemed just as vulnerable as he felt. Had she seen him check her out? "Speak, idiot."
What are you doing?
Wow, not only did his voice sound strange, he decided to ask a stupid question. "Showering?" He nodded as images flashed into his mind that shouldn't.
Okay, what I meant to say was, why are you up this early?
She wrapped her arms around the towel and glanced down at the floor. "I guess I wanted to see what the rancher's life entails." She met his gaze. "And you kind of said I didn't have what it takes, so here I am." He raised his eyebrows.
You're coming with me?
Christine nodded. "If that's okay." Was that okay? What was he supposed to say? No? That having you around me confuses me and frustrates me? That the fact you're here to investigate the one thing I have left in my life kills me inside? He clenched his fists. He needed to get a grip. Confessing any of those things was way too much. Besides, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to know that much about him. So he just nodded as he stepped closer to her. Her eyes widened as she glanced up at him.
I'll meet you downstairs in 15 minutes.
He peered down at her. He'd be lying to himself if he said he didn't enjoy how close their bodies were at this moment. Or the way her cheeks hinted pink and her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but was scared. It made her appear real and human, and someone he could relate to. Christine sat at the kitchen table waiting for Sean to come down from upstairs. She adjusted the tank top that she'd picked out. It wasn't Emma's plaid shirt, but she couldn't very well wear the same outfit 2 days in a row. Hopefully her clothes were somewhat appropriate for what they were going to do. The thought of Sean seeing her in her outfit caused her stomach to twist. Their earlier interaction rolled around in her mind. What had that been? Her thoughts returned to his tanned chest. Well, she'd been right. He was pretty muscular. Ripped would probably be the correct word. And his scar? It ran from the top of his shoulder and disappeared under his underarm. She wanted to ask him about it. The more time she spent around him, the more she wanted to know everything there was to know about Sean Petty. He confused and excited her at the same time. Butterflies flitted around in her stomach as she thought about spending the day with him, learning what it was like to be a rancher. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs filled the air, and Christine's heart rate picked up. She shifted in her seat, hoping to appear relaxed instead of the nervous mess she'd become. Sean walked into the room wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. His hair was damp, and for a moment Christine wondered what it might feel like to run her fingers through it. "Get your head on straight," she scolded herself.
Get some food?
He asked. Not sure what to do, Christine stood. No. He opened the cupboard and pulled out a container.
I hope you like oatmeal.
She nodded. Sounds amazing. Then she winced at her words. Amazing? Really? He raised his eyebrows as he ran his gaze over her.
Do they not have oatmeal in Washington, D.C.?
She leaned against the counter, hoping that she looked more relaxed than she felt. No, they have oatmeal. He nodded as he grabbed some bowls.
You just really like it?
Realizing that she wasn't going to be able to redeem herself, she decided to just go along with it. Yes. He chuckled as he filled the bowls with water and oatmeal and stuck them in the microwave. 5 minutes later, they sat at the counter with their steaming bowls. Sean motioned toward the sugar at the far end of the counter.
Feel free to use some for your amazing oatmeal.
He shot her a smile. Christine merely nodded as she began spooning some oatmeal into her mouth. Just as the heat touched her tongue, she winced. Yeah, that was a bad idea. Shoving her face full of food with the hopes that she wouldn't say anything stupid again was pretty dumb. Maybe she should crawl back into bed. Was she ridiculous to think that just maybe she could prove herself to this cowboy? That she just might have something she could offer him? That she could be something other than just a pencil-pushing auditor? Sometimes she could be such a fool. After the bowls were empty, Sean grabbed them both and put them into the sink. He turned around, cracking his knuckles and smiling over at her.
"Well, let's get to it then,"
he said, motioning toward the door. Christine nodded and made her way over to slip on Emma's boots. When she turned back around, she noticed Sean's gaze.
"Is that what you're wearing?"
he asked, motioning towards her camisole and jeans. "I don't really have anything else." He raised an eyebrow as he reached past her and opened up a door. His arm brushed her shoulder, sending shivers down her skin.
"Here,"
he said, handing her a gray hoodie. She took it and slipped it on. It was big. The sleeves hung down past her fingertips. She shoved them up to her elbows. The part that was throwing her off guard was how good it smelled. She had figured that ranches stunk from the animals they were around all the time, but Sean's hoodie didn't. It had a woodsy smell with a hint of flowery detergent. She wanted to close her eyes and breathe deep, but he'd probably think she was crazy, so she decided against it. Sean turned the handle and pulled the door open.
"Let's get to it,"
he said, motioning to the back steps. Christine made her way onto the porch as Sean joined her. He shut the door and then went down the stairs and led her over to the barn. The morning air was crisp, and the beginning bursts of light from the sun could barely be seen over the horizon. Even though they were the first ones up, it seemed as if the wildlife had been awake for hours. A few cats meowed and rubbed themselves against her legs. She reached down to pet them. Sean opened the barn door, which startled the cats, and they bolted. He waved her over.
"Come on,"
he said. Christine walked into the barn to see 2 four-wheelers parked along the wall. "We're riding these?" Sean picked up a helmet and handed it over to her.
"Scared?"
She shook her head, which was a lie. Truth was, she was terrified of crashing and losing a limb. She liked all her appendages and didn't want to give any of them up. Sean winked at her as he shook the helmet at her.
"It's okay, I'll go slow."
Christine nodded as she took it from him and slipped it on. Once she tightened the strap, she glanced over at Sean. He'd already gotten on the machine and was flipping buttons. He nodded toward the spot behind him.
"Climb aboard."
She hesitated, but then walked over. Not sure what to do with her hands, she finally pushed away all her fear and rested her hands on his shoulders. She felt his muscles tighten and then relax. It intrigued her that he had responded to her touch. She swung her leg over the seat and sat down. She shifted, pulling her hips closer. He tensed again when she bumped into him.
"Wrap your arms around my waist,"
he said. It might have been the helmet, but it sounded almost as if his voice had deepened, like he too was having a physical reaction from her close proximity, which was screaming at her to get off of the four-wheeler and get back into the house. She held onto his broad chest. She pushed the thoughts that were rolling around in her mind away, the ones that said only pain and heartache came from having feelings for a cowboy. She held her breath as her fingers grazed the muscles under his shirt. The warmth he gave off surrounded her and caused her heart to hammer in her chest. Even though her mind was screaming at her to run, she was frozen to this spot. Everything felt so right in this moment. Sean counted down, and in a few seconds he peeled out of the barn. Christine had to hang on as the momentum of the four-wheeler tried to pull her back. When Sean finally got a good coasting speed, she shifted away from him and took in the sights. The tip of the sun was now visible on the horizon. There was a slight haze to the ground from the mist that still lingered in the air. Grass spanned out in front of them. In the distance, she could see the dark figures of cows moving around the fields. Trees dotted the terrain that rose and fell. It was peaceful and serene. Her chest swelled at the sight. Sean neared the cows and drove around them. She couldn't quite tell what he was doing, but it almost seemed as if he were looking for something. Most of the animals had their heads down, eating grass. To her, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After they circled the cows a few more times, Sean peeled off. She saw his head tilt toward her.
"I'm missing one," he called to her.
Christine looked back. How did he know that? Was she supposed to believe that he knew each and every one of his animals? But trying to have a conversation with their helmets on was pointless. so she just nodded as she held tighter to his back. Chapter 11. Sean. Something was wrong. When he'd done his morning count of the cows and didn't see the one with a white patch above its eye, he had a sinking feeling that it was missing. Bessie, the cow that he and his grandmother had raised together, was not with the group, which could mean one of two things. One, she'd been attacked by a pack of wolves, which wasn't unheard of around here. Or two, she had wandered off to give birth. Either situation scared him. He'd bottle-fed her from infancy until she joined the herd. And if something ever happened to her, well, he wasn't sure if he'd ever forgive himself. Thankfully, Christine didn't question him. She just held on as he sped down the hills and valleys. 10 minutes into the search and Sean almost gave up. Perhaps it had been the coyotes after all. Suddenly a sharp tap drew his attention up. Christine leaned in and shouted, waving her hand toward the left. In the distance, Bessie was lying on the ground. Sean's heart surged as he sped over to where she was. Screeching to a halt, he turned off the ignition and unbuckled his helmet. He threw it to the side as he knelt down beside her. She was breathing, deep and jagged breaths. But she was alive, and that was all he cared about at this moment. His gaze roamed her body and stopped at her tail. Her sides were contracting. Sean? Christine's voice startled him. He looked up to see her standing there, staring at Bessie's rear end. Something wasn't right.
What?
He asked, standing and walking around to see the hind legs of a calf. Is she in labor? Christine asked. Her hand went up to cover her mouth. Sean didn't have time to discuss this. From how limp Bessie's head was, she'd been at this all night and the baby wasn't coming out on its own.
We need to help her,
he said, unbuttoning his shirt and pulling it off. Births could get messy. We meaning me? Christine stuck her thumb towards her chest. Sean nodded.
You wanted to see what a rancher did. Here it is. It's dirty and life-threatening.
He steadied his gaze. Truth was, he was just as terrified. He didn't want Christine to leave. He wanted her right here next to him. Her skin paled as she ran her gaze from Bessie over to him. Sean? She swallowed. I'm not strong, she whispered. He shook his head.
Doesn't matter. I'll tell you everything you need to know.
He grabbed onto the calf's hind legs and waited until he saw Bessie's sides contract. Then he pulled with all his might. Bessie mooed. She weakly brought her head up.
Calmer,
he said, nodding toward Bessie. Christine paced for a moment before she knelt down in front of the cow. He saw her lean over Bessie's head. He could tell she was whispering things to the cow, but couldn't make them out from where he sat. After 15 minutes of pulling along with the contractions, the calf wouldn't budge. Bessie's efforts were becoming weaker and weaker. As much as he hated it, he needed to perform a C-section. Bessie might not live, but the baby would. It was better than losing both.
I need you to come over here,
he yelled, waving at Christine. She hesitated, but then stood. When she got close, he dropped the legs of the calf and motioned for her to take his place.
I have to get my first aid kit in the four-wheeler. You need to stay here. When you see her contract, pull that sucker with all your strength.
Christine's eyes widened. You want me to do what?
Grab that baby's legs and pull,
tapping her shoulder and then making his way over to the four-wheeler. Any of her protests were lost in the wind as his mind raced with what he was going to have to do. Sean? Her voice broke through his clouded thoughts.
Yeah?
He asked as he opened the seat and lifted out the kit. Knife, gauze. He ticked the items off in his mind as he pulled them out and set them in a line next to each other. Sean! Christine's voice had turned frantic. He whipped around to see her covered in amniotic fluid and the calf right next to her. It was half covered in the birthing sack. He dropped the Band-Aids in his hand and rushed over.
Did you?
Christine was shaking as she held up her hands that were covered in blood. I think so, she whispered. Sean turned to the calf and began rubbing it with his shirt. It was limp. Its legs flopped against the ground as he tried to force life into the little guy.
Come on, he muttered, trying everything he could to wake it.
Is it going to live?
Christine asked. He glanced over to see her kneeling on the ground. She had tears in her eyes as she looked over at him. I don't know, he said, turning his attention back to the baby. Just as he was about ready to throw in the towel, the baby began to twitch its legs. Then its head began to move. A shout of joy came from Christine. She knelt down and wiped at the baby's eyes.
He's alive,
she said. When she looked up at him, she was smiling through her tears. Sean sat back on his heels and nodded. Yeah, he's going to be okay. Christine turned her attention back to the baby, a look of satisfaction written all over her face. 20 minutes later, Bessie and her baby were up and moving around in the grass. Bessie would walk a few feet, then the baby would stumble to catch up with her. Christine turned and smiled to him. That was pretty amazing, she said, then moved her gaze to her hands. I just wish it didn't come with so many fluids. Sean nodded as he shrugged. Sorry, hazard of the trade, I guess. He squinted as he studied her. What she'd done had been pretty miraculous. She needed to know that, but he wasn't sure how to tell her. So what are you going to name him? He asked. Her eyes widened. I get to name him? It's a petty tradition. If you help birth the baby, you get to name it. She shifted her gaze to stare just beyond him. Dragon. He laughed. That was not what he'd been expecting. Really? She smiled and nodded. I think it's fitting. Then she leaned in. Plus, none of the other calves can ever make fun of him. It's strong. She flexed her arms, and then her gaze fell to her skin. She dusted her hands as if that was going to wipe off the dried blood. Watching her gave him an idea. Hey, let me take you somewhere, he said as he straightened and made his way over to the four-wheeler. Christine followed. I hope it's not the Ritz. I have a feeling they might just turn me away. Sean smiled over at her. It's not the Ritz, it's even better. He handed her a helmet and patted the seat behind him. He drove the familiar path to the small lake that sat in the middle of his grandfather's land. He stopped just outside the thick brush and turned off the four-wheeler. He waited for her to get off and then he followed after her. Christine's eyes were wide as she pulled off her helmet. Did you bring me here to kill me? She asked. Sean laughed. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it once or twice. She shoved his shoulder. He raised his hands. Joking. Then his expression turned serious. There was something about her. The way she hadn't given up on that baby. The way she'd thrown herself into that crazy mess that the birth had been. She'd proven herself to be a rancher today. You did good out there, he said, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but kept his fingers inches from her skin. Her gaze fell to his hand and then up his arm to meet his gaze. I did? She asked. Her voice was quiet and unsure. Sean nodded. He needed to keep talking before his mind won out and he stopped. She needed to know. Parker's an idiot. If you attack audits the way you helped Bessie, then he's a fool for letting you go. He threw caution to the wind and made contact with her shoulder. Just as his fingertips grazed her skin, shots of electricity raced up his arm and exploded throughout his body. Christine's cheeks turned pink as she met his gaze. You're just saying that. I really didn't do much. I'm sure it's like a jar's lid. You just loosened it for me. Then she pinched her lips together and closed her eyes. He could tell she was mentally scolding herself. Somehow I never imagined someone describing birth like loosening a jar's lid, he said. She shook her head as she kept her lips pinched. If you'd have let me finish, I would have told you that you've earned a rancher celebration. Christine opened her eyes. Really? He nodded and turned her toward the foliage. It's through there. Christine started to walk and every so often turned around to glance back at him. Should I be nervous? He laughed and shook his head. I don't think so. Remember, not a murderer. Just as he said that, the thicket opened up. The bright blue water of the lake glistened in the sunlight. A lake? She said, turning around and meeting his gaze. An after-birthing swim. Swim? Sean nodded. What was she not getting about this? Do they not swim in Washington, D.C.?
Christine turned toward the water. They swim, in like bathing suits and such. She waved to her body, of which I have none.
Sean studied her. It's called living a little. Loosen up, dragon.
She huffed and turned to face him. Oh, I'm pretty loose, she said, twisting her head and rolling her shoulders. Sean leaned in. He was enjoying this back and forth they had. He liked that he could push her buttons.
Oh, and if you're loose enough, there's a swing over there for you to try.
Her gaze followed his motion and rested on the old tire swing that he and Jane had put up when they were kids. I am plenty loose. Sean sat down on the bank, resting on one shoulder.
Prove it.
She watched him. You're not coming? The familiar ache that could be solved by getting in the water resurfaced. He stared at the dark water and almost allowed himself to think about what it would feel like to jump into it. But then he shook his head.
Not for me.
Christine stared at him. Oh no. If I'm getting in, you're getting in.
No, there's no way I can get back into the water.
He moved farther away from the water's edge. As tempting as it sounded, he couldn't go down that path again. He closed himself off from anything that used to matter to him. Right now, he needed to protect himself, and that meant staying away from his past. When his gaze met hers again, he saw understanding there. She nodded as she reached up and unbuttoned her pants. I get it. I'll go. She started to shimmy out of them, but then paused. Mind turning around? Sean's heart began to pound, so he turned away and studied the bush behind him. The sound of her splashing into the water caused him to turn back around. Just before she slipped under the water's surface, he caught a glimpse of her lacy underwear. That was a mistake. He should have stayed turned around. When she dipped under the water and resurfaced, he was relieved that her entire body was covered by the water. Her head bobbed above the surface. Her shoulders emerged every so often, showing the straps of her camisole. She smiled. You're really missing out. Sean found a large rock and sat down on it. He knew he was missing out, but right now he wanted to stay away from any part of his past that haunted him. Plus, getting into the water with Christine didn't seem like the right idea at all. Not with the feelings that were burning in his chest. She was studying him when he turned his attention back to her. Her eyebrows were raised as she treaded water. Then she flipped on her back and began to backstroke to the other side of the lake. He watched as her figure grew smaller the farther she got. Then she flipped around and made her way back. He started to relax, enjoying the heat of the sun on his skin. He tipped his head back and breathed. It was the first time in a long time he'd stopped. Normally he was running from place to place, putting out fires here and there. But at this moment he was just himself, Sean, and that was it. Splashing drew his attention toward the lake. Sean's gaze raced across the lake until he saw Christine dip below the water and then flail as she came back up. When his gaze met hers, he saw the panic inside it. Then she slipped back under the water. Before he could think, he'd pulled off his jeans and shirt and dived into the water. There was no way he could let her drown. She needed him. He sped over to her, his body slicing through the water like that was all it had been made for. When he got to the place where she disappeared, he dove into the water and searched. He found her floating a few feet down. He kicked his way over to her, grabbing her body and shot to the surface. He gasped for air as he turned her onto her back and ran his gaze over to her face. Her eyes were closed and it seemed as if she wasn't breathing. "Christine?" he asked, grabbing her around the middle and swimming one-handed toward the shore. "Sean?" When he glanced behind him, he saw that her eyes were open, that she was smiling. Why was she smiling? Realization sunk in. She'd faked drowning just to get him into the water. He stopped swimming when his feet touched the ground and faced her.
That was fake?
She shrugged as she treaded water. I needed to get you in somehow. She smiled over at him with an innocent look on her face. He reached over and wrapped his hand around her arm, pulling her toward him. The water splashed into her face. She sputtered. He pulled her close and then looked deep into her eyes. She stilled as her eyebrows rose. Enjoying the effect he seemed to have on her, he let his gaze fall to her lips and then back up again. Her breathing changed as he could feel her hesitate. Then he pushed her back.
"Not funny," he said as he turned and started swimming toward the shore.
"Hey!" she protested. He felt her fingers grab his arm and pull him back. He fought for a minute, but then let her drag him close, which was a mistake. She pulled him so close that he was only inches from her. "I'm sorry," she breathed, and her expression turned serious. "I didn't mean to worry you. I just thought that maybe if you got into the water, you'd remember how good it felt. And perhaps," she reached out her hand and ran her fingers across the scar on his shoulder, "it would help you move on." Shivers ran up his body from where her fingers touched him. She glanced up and met his gaze. It might have been his imagination, but it was also as if she were inching closer and closer to him. And he'd be lying if he said he didn't want her as close to him as possible. In this moment, the only two people who existed were him and her. They were all that mattered. Not his past, not his future, just the two of them. He was done with thinking, so he reached out and wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her against him. Her eyes widened as he looked down at her. "Sean?" she whispered, her hand sliding up his shoulder to the back of his neck.
"Dragon Lady?"
She shoved his shoulder, sending him a few inches away. He wrapped his other arm around her hand. Her expression turned serious and she chewed on her lip. He leaned forward to whisper into her ear.
"I've never kissed a dragon before."
He pulled back to look into her eyes. "Well, I've never kissed a cowboy either." And that was all he needed. He bent down and pressed his lips against hers. Chapter 12. Christine. Thankfully, Sean was holding on to her when he dipped down and pressed his lips against hers. As soon as he made contact, she forgot how to do anything. His lips were light at first, exploring and testing her own, but then he deepened the kiss, pushing out all rational thought from her mind. In that moment, all she wanted was him, all of him. Worried he might back away, she wrapped her fingers up in his hair. If he let her go, she might slip into the water's depths. He responded by pressing her body so close to his that she couldn't tell where she ended and where he began. He pulled back and peered down at her. "Are you okay?" he asked. Too stunned to speak, Christine just nodded. Never in her life had she ever felt this way for anyone. So frustrated one minute, and then the next minute, completely intoxicated. She leaned closer and he met her lips again. He let out a guttural sound as he deepened the kiss. For the first time in a long time, Christine felt whole, like she was exactly where she belonged. She allowed herself to forget why she was here and what she needed to do. Instead, she allowed her mind to be consumed with one thought: Sean. Once they finally broke contact, they swam for the rest of the afternoon. Christine enjoyed watching Sean cannonball into the water from the tire swing. No coaxing from him convinced her to do the same. The branch it was tied to bent uncomfortably low when he was on it, and she really didn't want to risk her life to try it out. By midday, the sun was high in the sky. Christine dragged herself out of the water and laid down on one of the large rocks by the water's edge. Sean followed after her. She tried not to stare at how the water droplets glistened off his tanned skin, or how his chest looked like it came off of a Greek statue.
"What are you staring at?"
he teased, lifting up his arms as if to strike a warrior pose. Heat raced to her cheeks as she dropped her gaze. What was she supposed to say? That he looked amazing? Are all cowboys so muscular? Just as she said the words, she pinched her lips shut. What was that?
"Am I muscular?"
He flexed again, turning so she could see his back. She rolled her eyes. Never mind. He plopped down next to her, resting his weight on one elbow.
"No, I want to hear how you think I'm this ripped guy."
He smiled up at her with the cheesiest grin. "I didn't say that. I was asking in generalized terms, so when I meet another cowboy, I know if it's an expectation or if you're the exception." He scooted closer to her.
Another cowboy? What are you talking about?
He grabbed her hand and brought it to his lips and kissed each finger.
With me around, you'll never need another cowboy.
He wriggled his eyebrows as he looked up at her. She giggled and scooted away from him. He reached out and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. His face grew serious as he gazed over at her.
Are you enjoying your time here in Montana?
Christine looked at him. For a moment she allowed herself to get lost in his gaze. There was a rawness to his expression, like he was trying to open up, and that thought made her heart soar. But as quickly as it came, she pushed it away. What was she thinking? Did she seriously think that this was okay? That neither of them was going to walk away unscathed? She was here to audit his ranch. His ranch. This wasn't a vacation or chance meeting. She was here to uncover secrets that just might destroy him. So, despite how much it broke her heart, she broke contact with him and pulled back. It was nice. Nothing like the pools in Washington, D.C., but not everything can be. She sat up and reached for her jeans. They were covered with mud from earlier, but she didn't care. She needed to get out of here, put distance between her and Sean. Once she was dressed, she looked over at him. "We should go," she said. He was still leaning back on one elbow, studying her. She could tell he was thinking. She just wasn't sure about what. Did she want to know? Thankfully, he didn't push her. Instead, he stood, shook out his pants, and pulled them on. Christine slipped on her boots, and then they started through the thicket together. Sean was quiet. It was as if he understood her thoughts, even though she hadn't said them out loud. As much as she wanted to take it back, she knew she couldn't. Not if she was going to save either of them from heartbreak. Feelings weren't a luxury, they were allowed. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, and Christine reveled in it. She was grateful that the rush of the wind mixed with the helmet meant there wasn't an opportunity to speak, even if they'd wanted to. He pulled into the barn and shut off the four-wheeler. Christine climbed off, setting her helmet down on the ground. She needed a shower, a change of clothes, and to get back to work. Focusing on why she was really here seemed like the best move. But as she made her way out of the barn, she stopped. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want him to be angry with her. She just wanted to keep him safe and her heart protected. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out lower than she'd intended. He set his helmet down on the bench next to the four-wheeler and turned around. His expression had turned stony as he peered over at her. "For what?" She fought back the tears that clung to her lids. What was the matter with her? He was the frustrating cowboy that she was here to audit. She wasn't supposed to have feelings for him. That was not part of the job. Desperate to protect herself, she cleared her throat and forced a smile. "I just thought perhaps I hurt your feelings, which, now that I say it out loud, sounds ridiculous." She ran her hands through her damp hair. "I'm just going to go inside now." She turned and made her way up the porch steps, and didn't stop until she was locked in the guest room. Now alone, she sat down on the bed and studied her hands. Why was she reacting this way? Perhaps what Parker had said was true. She did get too emotionally attached. Perhaps auditing in the field wasn't the right thing for her. Frustrated with how jumbled her emotions were, she pushed off the bed and headed toward the bathroom. A shower sounded amazing. Just the thing she needed to wash away everything that had happened that morning. Especially the kiss, the one that had left her speechless. The hot water pounded on her back, relaxing her muscles. She leaned against the shower wall and took a few deep breaths. She needed to get her head on straight and focus, do her job, and then get the heck out of Moose Falls. After she was dried and dressed, she pulled her hair back into a braid and made her way downstairs. Mr. Petty was sitting at the table when she entered the kitchen. "Hi, Mr. Petty," she said, walking over to the cupboard and grabbing a glass.
"Hello, Christine."
She jumped and turned. Her stomach sank as she stared into the eyes of Parker. What was he doing here? Parker? She squeaked. She cleared her throat. I mean, Parker, what are you doing here? He leaned back in his chair and folded his arm. I've come to check up on you. Well, at least he was to the point. Why? Well, I've been chatting with Mr. Petty here, and he informed me that you haven't been focusing on the case. Is this true? Parker met her gaze head on. Well, it's been a bit harder for me to get to the paperwork. My car broke down and I've needed to depend on rides. Parker's eyebrows rose with each excuse she gave him. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what she could say to get him to stop staring at her. She felt like a little kid getting scolded by her grandfather. Christine, you told me that you could handle this. You gave me your word. I trusted you. He narrowed his eyes. Realizing there was nothing she could say that would convince him that she wasn't an idiot, she lowered her gaze and nodded. I know, I'm sorry. The sound of the chair leg scraping the floor drew her attention up. Parker had pushed back from the table and was standing, buttoning his suit coat. Now, since I'm here, I might as well lend my expertise. He walked over to her and extended an arm. Take me to the files. Christine nodded and downed the water in the glass. Once it was empty, she turned and set it in the sink. Right this way, she said, leading him out of the kitchen and over to the study. She waved toward the boxes. I was organizing yesterday to get started. Parker lifted up the top paper and stared at it. This is all you've done? He gave her a disapproving stare. You've been here for 2 days. Most would have finished and started on their next project by now. Christine swallowed. I know, I'm sorry, I was just... You were trying to get to know the people. He clicked his tongue as he picked up another sheet of paper. It's no use, I told you. That is not our job. We are here to gather facts, and that is all. But what if there are situations the facts don't show? She muttered under her breath. When she glanced back up at Parker, he had a disgruntled look on his face. That is all, Miss Jordan, he repeated as he grabbed the armrest of the desk chair and pulled it over. He settled down on it and pulled out a stack of papers. My flight isn't until this evening. Why don't I lend you my help while I'm here? Christine swallowed as she studied the window. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder where Sean was and what he might think of her boss showing up to check on her. Then she swallowed and forced herself to focus on the mound of papers in front of her. Sean probably didn't care. He was most likely out in the field doing what he loved. If anything, he'd be grateful that she wasn't alone. Parker being here only meant she'd be finished that much sooner. She sighed and pushed away a loose strand of hair. Right now, that seemed like the best answer for everyone. Chapter 13. Sean. Sean walked into the kitchen at 6:30. His body ached from head to toe. The house was quiet. Pops was most likely taking his afternoon nap, and Christine was working in the study. Taking a moment to himself, Sean walked over to the cupboard and pulled out a glass. He filled it with water and turned, resting his back against the counter behind him. He wanted to tell himself that it was because he tackled installing the new fence post holes with more vigor than normal, but he knew better. He hadn't worked hard to get the job done faster. He'd worked that fast because he hoped it would help him push all the thoughts he had about Christine to the back of his mind. Or forget her. Either one would have been nice. But nothing had worked. His muscles ached right alongside his heart. He had been a fool to let her into his life, to allow himself to care. He placed his cup into the sink and then made his way over to the phone. He needed to talk to someone who understood him, who understood the life he'd chosen. He dialed Austin's number and waited while the phone rang. Hello? Emma's sweet voice asked. Hey, Ems, is Austin there? Sean, how's it going? How's Christine? He tried not to groan. Talking about the dragon was the last thing he wanted to do. She's fine, doing her job.
Is Austin there?"
Emma was silent for a moment. "What happened?" she asked. Just like Emma to know exactly what was going on in his life, to see past his lie.
"The realization that certain things just aren't meant to be."
He cleared his throat.
"I don't really want to talk about it."
She sighed. "No, Austin's not here. He had to go into town. But I'm meeting him at the tavern. Why don't you join us?" Sean glanced in the direction of the study and nodded. That sounded like the best idea. Getting away from his house meant getting away from Christine, and right now that's all he wanted to do.
"Sounds perfect. I'll see you in an hour."
"You got it." Sean said goodbye and then hung up the phone. He had enough time to shower and get dressed. Both of those tasks pretty much guaranteed that he wasn't going to see Christine. And that thought made his heart pound. Keeping himself away from her meant keeping himself safe, and that was what he needed right now. After a hot shower, he wrapped a towel around his waist and opened the bathroom door. He jumped when he saw Christine standing just outside the door with her arms folded. Her gaze dropped to his chest, but then back up to meet his. Her eyes narrowed.
"What?"
he asked, stepping around her and into the hall. "I have to talk to you about something," she said, grabbing onto his arm and leading him to his room. His heart pounded. What did she have to talk to him about? The thought that this might be the moment she declared her feelings for him made his mouth dry. What was he going to say back? Emotions bubbled up inside of him. His thoughts rested on the tip of his tongue. When they got into his room, she shut the door and turned around. Her cheeks were pink as she paced the floor. Something wasn't right. He felt like such an idiot. Of course she wasn't going to confess her feelings to him. Man, was he stupid. She'd found something, and it wasn't good. She stopped and turned to meet his gaze. "How many calves are born on the ranch in a year?" He made his way over to his bed and sat down. Why would she want to know that?
"I don't know, 200 plus."
She wrung her hands. "And how many do you keep in the herd?" This was getting strange. Was this a crime?
"Maybe 10%.
She rested her forehead on her hands as she took deep breaths. There was no record of sale or payment in taxes for any sale of livestock for 2 years. She looked over at him. "Did you know about that?" Sean's stomach sank to the floor. What had his grandfather done? Why would he do that?
2 years?
Christine nodded. "How much does a calf go for?" Sean swallowed.
800.
She shook her head. "Do you know why he would do this?" Sean couldn't handle sitting there anymore. He stood and started to pace.
"There's no record, nothing?"
She shook her head. "The only income that was claimed is what was made from selling hay and random vending operations." Sean ran his hand through his hair.
"I'll talk to my pops."
She nodded as her gaze slipped to his chest. "Okay, you do that. I'm gonna go so you can get dressed." He nodded, but before she slipped from the room, he grabbed her elbow.
"You'll let me find out before you tell your boss, right?"
Her complexion paled as she shifted her gaze away from him.
"Christine?"
What wasn't she telling him? "You don't know?" He shook his head. His stomach was in knots. It was rapidly becoming evident that he was losing control of the situation. She leaned closer to him. "My boss is downstairs. He was the one asking me about it." Her voice was so low that he almost didn't hear her. He studied her. Had she said what he thought she'd said?
"What?"
She shut the door and then glanced up at him. "He just showed up. He wasn't happy with my results, so he came out here to, I don't know, help me, I guess." And just like that, Sean saw his dream of owning the ranch slip through his fingertips.
"What does this mean?"
"I don't know." Her voice dropped as she watched him, as if she were expecting him to storm out, which was exactly what he wanted to do. He walked over to his dresser and pulled out a shirt and pants. Then he passed by Christine, who looked as if she was poised to protest.
I've got to go. I'm meeting Emma and Austin at the tavern. You guys finish up whatever you're doing. You don't need me here."
He reached out and opened the door. The walls of the house felt as if they were closing in on him. He needed some air, and he needed to get away from Christine and what she was about to do to him. He went into the bathroom and shut the door. After he dressed, he pounded down the stairs and out the front door. Christine must have gone back to the study because she was nowhere to be found. When he got to his truck, he pulled open the door and jumped into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life as he made his way out of the drive and onto the main road. Gravel spit up around him as he peeled off. The 30-minute drive into town wasn't nearly long enough. He was still fuming when he pulled into the parking lot of the tavern and shut off his truck. He needed some time away from everything right now. He needed time to process what exactly was happening. He pulled open the door to the tavern and some twangy music carried out. He walked in and scanned the inhabitants. Emma and Austin were sitting at the back booth, watching the singer on the stage wail into the microphone. Relieved to see some familiar faces, Sean made his way over and dropped down into the seat across from them.
"You look like hell, man," Austin said, glancing over at him.
Sean scrubbed his face.
"You have no idea."
A worried expression passed over Emma's face. "Did Christine find anything?" A sour feeling rose up in his throat.
"It's not good. Apparently my pops hasn't been claiming sales of the calves on his returns. He's kept this a secret for years."
Sean swallowed as his stomach churned. What was he going to do? He didn't even have enough money to cover this, and the IRS was not going to be understanding about it. They got paid, period. "Is Christine going to report it?" Emma asked with her eyes wide.
"Babe, she has to. It's her job," Austin said.
Sean wanted to yell. He wanted to say it wasn't fair, that his grandfather wasn't thinking when he was watching his wife slowly slip away from cancer. He should be given a second chance. Something. But the government didn't work like that, and Sean knew it. Everyone needed to pay in and do their civic duty. This whole situation just felt unfair. 30 minutes later, Sean leaned back in the booth, watching as couples moved around the dance floor. Austin and Emma were in the throng of people. They had kept the conversation light and fluffy, even though a dark cloud hung over the table. Sean tapped his finger on the table to the beat of the music. It was amazing what some food and time did for his mood. So what if his grandfather didn't pay the taxes? Sean Petty wasn't the kind of guy who just rolled over and took the beating. He was going to fight this. He was going to keep his ranch, even if it killed him. "Mind if I sit with you?" Sean straightened as Christine stepped into his line of sight. Her eyebrows were raised and so were her hands, as if she were anticipating some blowback from him. He shot her a smile. Maybe he could convince her to say something on behalf of his ranch. Maybe she could get his punishment lightened. There had to be something she could do.
"Sure,"
he said, waving toward the spot across from him. She slipped into the booth and glanced over at him. Her expression was still one of unease. She fiddled with an unused napkin, then leaned forward. "Are you sure you're okay?" He shot her a smile. This really wasn't something he wanted to talk about.
"How did you get here?"
She quirked an eyebrow at him as she cleared her throat. "I had my boss drop me off before he headed to the airport."
"Your boss, huh? He left?"
She nodded. "Yes." From the look on her face, he knew the reason why. Her boss was leaving because the case had been solved. They discovered the truth, and that was all they needed. No more reason to stick around. Sean slid out of the booth and stood.
"I understand,"
he said as he turned. Why was he letting this bother him? A hand gripped his elbow. Whipping around, he saw Christine standing behind him with a concerned expression. "Can we talk about this?"
"What's there to talk about? You're going to sink me, you know that?"
His stomach squeezed at his words. He knew that what he'd said wasn't technically true. There wasn't much that Christine could do. He just wished that she'd try. Or perhaps the kiss they'd shared in the lake had only meant something to him. She stared at him with her lips parted. The music stopped and the singer began to speak. Sean only picked up on bits and pieces as he turned his attention over to the man. "It's ladies' choice, so ladies, go out and grab yourself a partner." Then the twangy music started up, and the couples began dancing around again. "Do you want to dance?" Christine asked, motioning toward the dance floor. Was she serious? First she comes to investigate him, then gets him to fall for her and rips his heart out?
"I have to go."
He turned but found Emma standing behind him. She pointed her fingers at his chest. "I don't think so. You dance with that girl," she said, nodding in Christine's direction.
"Emma, this doesn't concern you."
He sidestepped her, but she turned, bumping him with her tummy. "I understand your stubbornness, Sean Petty. Now you be a gentleman and dance when a lady asks you." She folded her arms and tapped her fingers. Sean stared at her, but then realized that he wasn't going to get around her. He turned and nodded toward Christine.
"Let's do this."
Chapter 14. Christine. Why she thought that dancing with Sean was a good idea boggled her mind. What was she thinking? He was standing on the dance floor, practically glaring at her. But she was desperate. She needed him to hear her out. Trapping him between boot-tapping couples seemed like the best way. His jaw flinched as he raised one arm up and extended the other one.
"Let's get this over with,"
he said. Not the most romantic thing a man had ever said to her, but right now she would take it. So she stepped forward, bringing her hand up to rest on his shoulder as she placed her other hand in his hand. He moved forward and she followed. Soon they were dancing around the other couples. Sean kept his gaze above her head. Christine desperately wanted to talk to him, to explain to him that what his grandfather did was wrong, that she had no choice but to follow through with her report. She just didn't know how to start the conversation. "It's my job, you know that, right?" She winced as the words left her lips. Nothing like shooting straight from the hip. His eyes widened.
"Of course I understand that it's your job."
He shifted and guided her away from a particularly enthusiastic couple that was barreling toward them.
"But it's my home. You can't fault me for wanting to protect it."
Christine leaned back to look into his eyes. Protect it? He felt like he needed to protect it from her? Parker, maybe, but her? She had tried to fight Parker about it before he left. She'd asked him if he would consider lowering the amount paid back. If anything, she was standing behind him. Sean sighed and pulled away. He took a few steps off the dance floor and looked over at her.
"I know it's not your fault,
He took a deep breath.
I can't get involved with you or anyone right now. I need to focus on the ranch and get us out of this mess."
"Sean,
Who are we kidding? A rancher and an auditor would never work. You're from the city and I'm the opposite from the city as you get."
He rubbed the back of his neck with his hand.
"It's probably best for you to finish up and go home."
He turned to walk away. Christine stared at him. Was that really all he was going to say to her? But she had so much she needed to tell him. She reached out for his elbow, but he pulled back, breaking her contact.
"I need to go, now,"
he said over his shoulder. She parted her lips to speak, but before she could process what was happening, Sean had stalked off, and she was left alone to stare at his retreating frame. She swallowed and blinked back tears. She could do this. She was strong. There was no way she was going to let this cowboy rattle her. Turning, she glanced through the crowd and located Emma and Austin. She made her way over. Emma pulled back, took one look at Christine, and studied the room. "Where's Sean?" she asked. "Gone, and he instructed me to go back to Washington as well." Her voice wavered from that declaration, but she pushed down her emotions. Sean was a jerk, and she wasn't going to cry over a jerk. Emma pulled away from Austin and wrapped her into a big hug. "I'm so sorry. Sean's an idiot." Christine just patted her back, not sure what to say or do. There was no way she was going to let the world know that she had feelings for Sean. That him sending her away was breaking her heart. He didn't deserve that part of her. "Can you give me a ride?" Emma glanced over at Austin, who nodded. "Of course I can. Come on, I've got to grab my keys." Austin let her go, and then she led the way over to the table. She grabbed her purse and waved at Christine to follow. Once they got outside, Emma led her over to the truck and unlocked the doors. Christine climbed in alongside Emma. They buckled their seat belts and Emma started the engine. 2 minutes down the road, Emma turned to look at her. "Want to talk about it?" Christine swallowed as she thought back to their conversation, her heart breaking all over again. The way Sean looked at her, the way he accused her of not caring, or the way he said that he didn't want her around. "Sean hates me," she said, glancing out the window. "He does not hate you." Christine scoffed. It really felt like he did. "Sean's worried and protective. He's not sure what to do. It's not right, whatever he said, but he's just confused." Emma clicked her tongue. "That's the cowboy curse. They're as bull-headed as the steers they raise." She laughed. "Listen to me. You would have never guessed 2 years ago I was living in New York taking pictures of food." Emma's laugh helped lighten the mood. If anything, Emma was the only one who would understand what she was going through. "But Austin seems so level-headed. I couldn't imagine him saying the same thing to you." Emma snorted. "Oh man, Austin and I have had some rocky times. Except with him, he thought sending me away would protect me." She rolled her eyes. "Dork. At least he sent you away because he cared about you. I thought Sean felt something for me, but boy was I wrong." Emotions rose up in her throat, choking her. She swallowed against the lump that had formed there. "Sean cares about you." Emma's soft voice pulled her attention over. "What?" Why was Emma causing her to hope? She needed to write that frustrating cowboy off forever. He didn't care about her, and he never would. "He's just protecting himself, probably because he cares about you a bit too much." She wiggled her eyebrows. "He sure has a funny way of showing it." Christine turned her attention back outside. They needed to stop talking about Sean right now. "Would you mind us driving in silence?" From the corner of her eye, she saw Emma nod. "Of course I wouldn't mind." They drove in silence the rest of the way. Christine spent the entire time trying to figure out what she was going to say to Sean when she saw him. By the time Emma pulled into his driveway, she decided on simple pleasantries. She didn't need to have a deep and meaningful conversation, but she could be civil. After all, that was what she'd been taught. She swallowed. She only hoped he'd believe the lie. The truck idled as Emma put it into park. Christine shot her a smile as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Thanks for the ride." Emma nodded. "Any time." Christine opened the door and started to climb out when a hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Christine?" She turned around to see Emma peering over at her. "Yeah?" "Don't give up on Sean just yet. He's confused. He'll figure it out." Her stomach twisted from Emma's words. Not sure what to say, she only nodded. "I'll try." She hopped out of the truck. "I'll see you later?" Christine nodded and shut the door. She stood in the dark and watched Emma drive away. Once her tail lights had disappeared in the distance, she turned back around. All the windows were dark. Wrapping her arms around her chest, she sighed. What was she going to do now? The next morning, when Christine finally pulled herself out of bed, she found the house completely quiet. She didn't expect to see Sean. It was 10:15, but that didn't stop her from jumping at every sound. Her one goal today was to finish the audit, so she could get the heck out of Moose Falls forever. Back to her boring life in Washington, D.C., where her friends made her feel wanted and cared about her. Or at least where cowboys didn't hate her. After brewing a pot of coffee, she poured a mug and made her way to the study. As she passed the living room, she saw Mr. Petty sitting in the rocking chair just as he had the day before. His weathered hands were gripping a picture frame. She stopped and studied him. His gaze was downturned as if he were sleeping. Not wanting to bother him, she tiptoed past. Just as she cleared the door frame, he called out to her. "Nancy?" She stopped, pinching her eyes shut. She couldn't just leave a grieving man sitting alone in the living room, thinking that his late wife had passed by and didn't take the time to stop and talk to him. So she let out her breath and she turned back around. "Sorry, Mr. Petty, it's just me." She smiled at him as she walked into the room. Mr. Petty looked so hopeful that when he saw her, she almost wished she'd been Nancy. His wrinkled cheeks elongated as his smile morphed into a frown. "My mistake," he said, glancing down at the picture one more time before he brought it back to his chest. "Was Nancy your wife?" She pulled up the ottoman so she could sit next to him. Mr. Petty glanced over at her. A spark had returned to his gaze. "She was. Wife of 50 years. She passed away a year ago. Cancer." Christine's heart broke as she rested her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry." He just nodded. A small tear slipped from his eye and rolled down his cheek. They sat in silence for a few minutes. The sound of the clock ticking in the other room surrounded them. Christine thought back to her discovery. She desperately wanted to know if what she'd found was a mistake. Perhaps he knew why there was no record of calves sold during those years. "Mr. Petty, can I ask you a question?" He turned his gaze over to her and nodded. "Sure." "I was going through your paperwork and I found something that I thought was odd. A few years back you showed no income for 2 years. At least no income from the sale of calves. Was that a mistake or just a really bad year?" Mr. Petty's skin paled, telling Christine everything she needed to know. It was true. He'd purposefully omitted the information. "Why? Why did you do that? You don't seem like a scammer. You're honest and hardworking. Why would you jeopardize your ranch like that?" Mr. Petty cleared his throat as he laid the picture down onto his lap. He ran his fingers over the frame. "Nancy got sick 3 years ago. Doctors told me that there was this miracle drug that could shrink the cancer cells. Unfortunately, it was still in testing phase and insurance didn't cover it." He dropped his voice. "Not like they cover much anyway." He mumbled a few more incoherent things. "Anyway, I was desperate. I needed to know I'd tried everything. I couldn't leave a stone unturned." Christine sat back as she let his words wash over her. He'd used the money to pay for the treatment. An ache took up residence in her heart. He just wanted to save his wife. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, even though she knew her words wouldn't mean anything. Mr. Petty turned to look at her, tears brimming in his eyes. "Miss Jordan, I don't know what to do. I can't ruin this for Sean. That boy's worked so hard, and if Nancy had found out what I did, she'd never forgive me either." Christine watched him, nodding as he spoke. She could only imagine the pain he was going through. If she could take it all away, she would. For Mr. Petty and for Sean, even though he broke her heart last night. "Mr. Petty, I'm going to do what I can to help," she said, reaching out and patting his hand. He smiled. "It's okay, it was a mistake. I will make it better, I have to." Christine wanted to ask how he planned on doing that. The man took 4-hour naps during the day. His tired gaze and worn complexion told her there wasn't much he could do. No, this was a problem that she could fix. She had to. And then Sean could send her away. Tell her that she wasn't allowed in his life. The only thing that would keep them apart then was his own stubbornness. That was something she couldn't change. It was up to him. So she gave Mr. Petty one more smile and stood, making her way to the study. She shut the door and got started on the paperwork. She needed to finish her audit and head back to Washington, D.C. to have a conversation with Parker. If her plan worked, she'd be able to confront the irritating cowboy with a clear conscience. She'd tell him just what she thought about him, and then he'd have to decide if he felt the same way. And if her plan didn't work, she'd leave and never look back. And no matter how much the thought broke her heart, she'd do it. Because one thing was for sure, he hated her. And she wasn't sure she could change anything about that. Chapter 15. Sean. Sean worked until it was dark. The last thing he wanted was to walk into the house to see Christine sitting there, confusing and frustrating him. His plan was to work all day, come home, shower, and go to bed. Talking to Christine wasn't part of the plan at all. He pulled open the back door and walked into the kitchen. He caught a glimpse of someone sitting at the table and dropped his gaze. His heart stuttered in his chest as he focused on pulling off his shoes and setting them next to the door. "You're an idiot." Whipping around, he saw Emma stand up from the table with her hands on her hips. She waddled over to him and stuck her finger into his chest. "Em, what are you doing here?" He peered behind her. Where was Christine? Then his heart sank. She was gone. "Austin's dropping her off at the airport." Sean swallowed. He knew he should be feeling relieved right now, but for some reason he didn't. His heart hurt. His stomach hurt. But he couldn't dwell on that fact right now. It was the best thing for the both of them to have her leave. They were wrong for each other. Emma threw up her hands. "What happened? You guys seemed so happy together. She was perfect for you." She narrowed her eyes. "You're a stubborn old goat, you know that, right? Why would you tell her to leave? She was just doing her job." Sean pushed past her and over to the sink. Emma wasn't going to let up. She followed after him. "So what do you have to say for yourself?" Sean looked over at her. She didn't understand. He needed to protect himself, protect his ranch. Letting Christine in might break him, and he wasn't sure if he would survive. "Can we just drop it?" Emma shook her head. "No can do. You need to tell me why you pushed her away." He washed his hands. "I told you, she's about to shut down my ranch. The amount we owe is going to break us." His voice dropped an octave. "Break me." She studied him as an understanding expression passed over her face. "Oh, I understand now." She gave him a small smile as she leaned against the counter and folded her arms over her tummy. She was acting cryptic. He narrowed his eyes. "Understand what?" She raised her eyebrows as she looked over at him. "You love Christine." He scoffed and turned to stare out the window. "I don't love Christine." She snorted. "Right. And this is nothing like when Austin sent me away because he was worried I'd get hurt." She leaned in. "Except in this case, he did it to protect me, not himself. That was nobler." "I'm noble." "Sean, look at yourself. You finally met a woman who not only challenges you, she cares about you too. And what do? You screw it up. You send her away." Sean stared at her. "She cares about me?" Emma pinched her lips together and nodded. "Well, she didn't say those words exactly, but I can tell she does." Sean scrubbed his face with his hand as he thought about Emma's words. Christine cared about him? He'd spent half of the time she was here calling her a dragon, and the other half making her feel bad because of her job. Man, he was the worst. "Good, I got through to you. Now, what are you going to do about it?" Emma studied him. Sean looked over at her.
Is there anything I can do? I messed up, Em. I really did. She probably hates me now.
Emma sighed. She'll forgive you, I promise. Now let's plan the big romantic gesture that will get her back. She rubbed her hands together. I'm excited. Sean watched a maniacal expression pass over Emma's face.
Should I be worried?
Chapter 16. Christine. 2 days later, Christine sat across from Parker, eyeing him. He was tapping the keys of his computer, taking his time to notice her. She swallowed. How was she going to ask him to help with the petty ranch, especially since he already thought she had done a terrible job? The clicking noise stopped as Parker turned to look at her.
Now, you wanted to talk to me?
He raised his eyebrows. They rose above the black-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. Christine took a deep breath and sat up straighter on her chair. Yes, I wanted to discuss the petty ranch. He took his glasses off and began to clean them with his tie.
I thought that file had been finished.
He paused.
Did you find a mistake you made?
Great. In one sentence, all her confidence flew out the window. No, not that. I, wanted to discuss what we could do to help. Parker coughed as he replaced his glasses.
Christine, the IRS is not in the habit of handing out charity to everyone who decides that they just don't want to pay their taxes.
He peered over at her. I understand that. It's just that there were reasons why the taxes weren't paid. Good reasons. Parker pressed his hands together and rested his elbows on the desktop in front of him.
I'm intrigued.
Thankful that he wasn't kicking her from his office, Christine smoothed her skirt and began. She told him about Mr. Petty, about how his wife got sick, how he used the money to fund the treatment. She told him how hard Sean had worked to save the money and how there was no other person in the world more suited to run that ranch than him. Parker studied her as she spoke, rocking slightly in his desk chair. He didn't look mad, but he also didn't look happy. Christine wasn't sure how to read his facial expressions. When she finished, she met his gaze. It looked like he was contemplating what she'd said. He picked up a pile of papers and shuffled them.
Do you know why I think you'll make an amazing auditor?
Christine stopped. Did he just say that she'd make an amazing auditor? Was he serious? What? Parker leaned back in his chair again.
When your uncle asked me to take you on, I didn't want to. I hate when family members hire other family members. I thought you were going to be a stuck-up snob who would run to her uncle every time something got hard.
She parted her lips to say that she would never do that, but Parker raised his hand.
Let me finish. You've never done that. You've met every deadline, work harder than anyone on your floor. And when I send you into the field, you not only got the job done, you also did more. See, people think we're just here to add numbers, go through receipts and report what we find. But there's so much more. We understand that it's hard and everyone has a different experience.
He gave her a smile, something she hadn't been sure he was even able to do.
And you came to me with your findings, not your uncle. So if you want to see if there's something the IRS can do for the petty ranch, then I'm okay with looking into it.
A huge weight lifted off Christine's shoulders as she stared at him. Who had taken Parker and what had they done with him? She discreetly pinched her leg just to make sure she wasn't dreaming. She was awake. I'm a little shocked, but thank you. Parker nodded. He glanced over at her as he turned back to his computer.
Do you need anything else?
Christine forced herself to shake her head. Shock still paralyzed her body. This had been the last thing she'd expected when she walked into his office a half hour ago. She pushed her body out of the chair and left. Out in the hall, she leaned against the wall, tipping her face toward the ceiling. Not only had Parker complimented her on her job, but he'd also said that he'd look into helping out Sean.
Her heart surged as she thought about what this meant. Sean would be able to keep his ranch, the place he loved. That thought made her happier than she'd been in a while. "I have a surprise for you," Ty Lynn sang out. Christine glanced over to see her friend walking up. "So do I," she said. Ty Lynn raised her eyebrows. "I bet mine's bigger." "No, mine is." Christine linked arms with her best friend and walked down the hall with her. "I highly doubt that." "Would you believe it if I told you that Parker actually told me I was good at my job? That he knew I was a hard worker? That I rose to the occasion?" Ty Lynn peered over at her. "No, I'd say you're lying." Christine shrugged. It felt good to say those words out loud, like it made them real. "Well, he did, and he said he'd help me find a solution for the petty ranch." Just saying Sean's last name caused her stomach to twist. She'd be lying if she said she didn't miss Moose Falls, or Sean. "Well, you're just telling me things I already know. I'm happy that Parker finally realized it too. You deserve it, sweetie. All the things he said were true." "Thanks." Christine felt as if she were walking on cloud 9. The only thing that would make this perfect was if Sean flew to Washington, D.C., and declared to her what an idiot he'd been. But that was a fantasy. "So what surprise did you have for me?" "That." Ty Lynn nodded down the hall, toward the large foyer of the building. Standing in the middle, with a huge bouquet of daisies, was Sean. He had on his signature plaid button-up shirt and jeans, with a cowboy hat and boots. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a rancher's magazine, if there was such a thing. Ty Lynn squealed next to her, grabbing her arm. "This is insane! No wonder you were distracted in Moose Falls. If that was who I was investigating, I'd be distracted too." "Ty Lynn," Christine said under her breath. She was pretty sure she knew the reason Sean was here, but just in case there was another reason he'd showed up here, clutching flowers, she didn't want him to overhear her loud best friend. "Oh, please, that boy's so smitten with you," she snorted as she pulled Christine toward him. Sean shifted from one foot to the other, and his eyebrows rose as they neared. Ty Lynn reached out her hands. "Tylen Grace." "Sean Petty." The deep sound of Sean's voice washed over Christine. Her heart picked up speed as she thought back to their time in Moose Falls. The feeling of his arms wrapped around her, or his lips pressed against hers. Had he only come here to taunt her? He was playing with her heart, and she was pretty sure it couldn't break any more. "So, Sean Petty, what brings you to the IRS building dressed like—" Ty Lynn waved her hand towards his clothes. His cheeks flushed red as he glanced around. "You said Pride and Prejudice was your favorite movie. Is this something Darcy would do?" He leaned closer to Christine. She couldn't quite find the right words to speak, so she just quirked an eyebrow. He cursed under his breath as he straightened. "Emma made me do this," he said. Christine should have known. Emma was a sneaky girl, but the one word that stood out to her was made. Emma had sent him to apologize? He didn't want to? "Well, I'm not sure why she would do that. From my experience, you don't do things you don't want to." She sidestepped him and headed to the front doors. There was no way she wanted to stand here, listening to how it was his duty to say sorry, or that his best friend's pregnant wife had scared him into coming. If he didn't want to be around her, then she'd make it easy. She'd leave and never look back. Just as she stepped outside, her gaze fell on a horse-drawn carriage. She paused as she studied it. Wow, this was getting ridiculous. Dipping her head down, she pushed through the throng of people who had gathered around it. The need to leave grew stronger. "Christine Jordan?" Sean's voice caused her to slow. "Can someone stop that woman, please?" A hand tapped her on the shoulder. "I think that guy wants to talk to you." Realizing there was probably no way she was going to be able to escape now, She turned to see Sean had climbed up onto the carriage and was staring at her. I was just honoring what you asked me to do. Leave. Why was he doing this? It wasn't fair. I'm an idiot, he said. His expression turned serious as his gaze met hers. Christine, I was wrong to send you away. I see that now. It had nothing to do with your job, and everything to do with the fact that I was scared. Why had he been scared? He had to know that she would do everything in her power to help him. I wasn't going to throw your ranch under the bus. Despite her best efforts, tears brimmed her lids. Why was she going to cry? His forehead creased as he studied her. I wasn't scared because I was going to lose my ranch. I was scared because I had fallen in love with you. Her mind swam as his words rang in her ears. What? There was no way she'd heard what she thought she'd heard. What was with the universe today? I said, I love you. Why else would I dress up like this and come here? You're the girl for me. You challenge me, you make me laugh, and your kisses drive me mad. Whoops and hollers rose up from the crowd around them. Heat burned Christine's skin. All eyes had turned to her as if they were expecting her to say something. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she wanted to say, but she still needed to be sure. How do I know once it gets hard again you aren't going to demand that I leave? A pained expression passed over Sean's face. I'm not going to say I'll never be an idiot again, but I can promise you that no man will love you as much as I do, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Come on, what do you say to that? An elderly woman who was standing next to her asked. Christine looked over at her. Honey, that man loves you. You'd be a fool to let him go. She nodded her head toward the carriage, her silver hair swishing from the movement. Christine turned her attention back to Sean, who looked as if he was rapidly losing his confidence. She pushed through the crowd and stopped right in front of the carriage. She eyed him, taking note of his hopeful expression. Do you forgive me? He asked. She held onto the handle and climbed the steps. Once she was standing next to him, she peered up to meet his gaze. On one condition. A smile played on his lips. Anything. Kiss me. His grin widened as he wrapped his arms around her and turned her to the side. As he cradled her head in his hand, he dipped her down. Yes, ma'am. When his lips met hers, every broken piece of her heart melded back together. Her soul sang as she brought her hands up to his shoulders and tangled her fingers in his hair. Yells and congratulations could be heard from the crowd, but Christine didn't care. As long as Sean was holding her, everything would be right in the world. He pulled away and smiled down at her. I love you, Dragon Lady. She swatted his shoulder, but then turned her expression serious. I love you, irritating cowboy. Before she could say anything more, he leaned down and whispered in her ear. I'll take it. And then pressed his lips against hers once more. At that moment, Christine knew everything was right in the world. There was nothing more she wanted than to be here, held by Sean. An excited bubble rose up in her stomach as she thought about what he would do when she told him about her conversation with Parker. Happiness spread from her head to her toes, and she basked in the feeling of completeness she felt. Her life now consisted of Sean, and nothing felt more perfect. Epilogue. The wind whipped around Christine as she rested her arm on the open window of Sean's truck. Her dress was digging into her back, so she shifted to lessen the twinge. A hand came into her view and wrapped around her fingers. Are you okay? Christine turned to see Sean smiling over at her. He'd loosened the bow tie he was wearing and it hung around his neck. The top button of his shirt was undone, exposing his tanned chest.
Christine slipped over to him and laid her head on his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her and pulled her close. She lifted up her hand to see the ring that was nestled on the fourth finger. She'd only been Mrs. Sean Petty for 3 hours now, and it was amazing. She felt him press his lips to her head.
"That was quite the reception,"
he said. Christine nodded. Emma sure did know how to throw a party. She just hoped Emma wouldn't be offended that they'd slipped out of there early. Christine was ready to spend the evening with her husband, alone. She bumped and jostled on the road as he pulled up to the house. Their house. An exciting feeling washed over her as she stared at it.
"Let me get the door for my bride,"
he said, opening the door and running around to grab hers. Once it was open, he reached up and took her hand. Now on the ground, Christine tried to keep her heels from digging into the dirt, but nothing helped. Suddenly, Sean's arms encircled her waist, and his other swept under her knee. He pulled her close to his chest. Christine wrapped her arm around his shoulders and nuzzled his neck. He smiled down at her.
"Hang on, Mrs. Petty. Let's get into the house first."
She laughed, but kept her head resting on his shoulder. When they got to the front door, Sean shifted her to his free hand. He turned the handle and kicked the door with his foot. He paused, glancing down at her.
"Are you ready for me to carry you over the threshold?"
Christine nodded, and just before he took a step, she called out, "Wait!" He stopped.
"What?"
She giggled. "Just kidding, I've been ready for this for a long time." He shot her an exasperated look and then carried her into the house and up the stairs to his bedroom.
"You and me both, babe."
He laid her on the bed and shook off his suit coat. She pulled her legs up as she watched him. A feeling washed over her. It was one of completeness. She had everything she wanted. Parker had called a week after their conversation to talk about a plan that the IRS had implemented. It was called the Fresh Start Program, and it significantly decreased the amount Sean owed. All he needed to do was get on a payment plan, and they'd get this whole mess fixed in a matter of a few years. Sean pulled off his bow tie and unbuttoned his shirt. She stared at his chest, reveling in the fact that he was all hers. He caught her staring and wiggled his eyebrows. She shrugged as he plopped down next to her, resting his body weight on an arm.
"What are you thinking about?"
She reached out and ran her hand across his cheek. "That I'm one lucky woman." He turned his face and kissed her palm.
"Not as lucky as I am."
"I love you, Sean Petty." He grinned up at her.
"Good."
She scoffed and whacked his shoulder. His expression turned serious as he sat up and took her face in his hands.
"I love you so much, Christine Petty, and I will spend the rest of my life showing you that."
She tipped her lips toward him, and he complied by kissing them ever so gently. "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." His gaze met hers, and in that one look, he'd told her everything she needed to know. Then he leaned forward and kissed her again, this time with more meaning, as if he wanted to show her through that kiss just how he felt about her. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was all she wanted, and she was never going to leave. Ever.